Sketches by Boz, Charles Dickens, Part 3, Characters, Chapter 1 Thoughts about People. It is strange with how little notice, good, bad, or indifferent, a man may live and die in London. He awakens no sympathy in the breast of any single person. His existence is a matter of interest to no one save himself. He cannot be said to be forgotten when he dies, for no one remembered him when he was alive. There is a numerous class of people in this great metropolis who seem not to possess a single friend, and whom nobody appears to care for. Urged by imperative necessity in the first instance, they have resorted to London in search of employment, and the means of subsistence. It is hard, we know, to break the ties which bind us to our homes and friends, and harder still to efface the thousand recollections of happy days and old times, which have been slumbering in our bosoms for years, and only rush upon the mind, to bring before it associations connected with the friends we have left, the scenes we have beheld too probably for the last time, and the hopes we once cherished, but may entertain no more. These men, however, happily for themselves, have long forgotten such thoughts. Old country friends have died or emigrated, former correspondents have become lost, like themselves, in the crowd and turmoil of some busy city, and they have gradually settled down into mere passive creatures of habit and endurance. We were seated in the enclosure of St. James's Park the other day, when our attention was attracted by a man whom we immediately put down in our own mind as one of this class. He was a tall, thin, pale person, in a black coat, scanty grey trousers, little pinched-up gaiters, and brown beaver gloves. He had an umbrella in his hand, not for use, for the day was fine, but, evidently, because he always carried one to the office in the morning. He walked up and down before the little patch of grass on which the chairs are placed for hire, not as if he were doing it for pleasure or recreation, but as if it were a matter of compulsion, just as he would walk to the office every morning from the back settlements of Islington. It was Monday. He had escaped for 24 hours from the thraldom of the desk, and was walking here for exercise and amusement, perhaps for the first time in his life. We were inclined to think he had never had a holiday before, and that he did not know what to do with himself. Children were playing on the grass, groups of people were loitering about, chatting and laughing, but the man walked steadily up and down, unheeding and unheeded, his spare, pale face looking as if it were incapable of bearing the expression of curiosity or interest. There was something in the man's manner and appearance which told us, we fancied, his whole life, or rather his whole day, for a man of this sort has no variety of days. We thought we almost saw the dingy little back office into which he walks every morning, hanging his hat on the same peg, and placing his legs beneath the same desk, first taking off that black coat which lasts the year through, and putting on the one which did duty last year, and which he keeps in his desk to save the other. There he sits till 5 o'clock, working on, all day, as regularly as the dial over the mantelpiece, whose loud ticking is as monotonous as his whole existence, only raising his head when someone enters the counting-house, or when, in the midst of some difficult calculation, he looks up to the ceiling as if there were inspiration in the dusty skylight with a green knot in the center of every pane of glass. About 5, or half past, he slowly dismounts from his accustomed stool, and again changing his coat, proceeds to his usual dining place, somewhere near Bucklersbury. The waiter recites the bill of fare in a rather confidential manner, for he is a regular customer, and after inquiring what's in the best cut, and what was up last, he orders a small plate of roast beef, with greens, and half a pint of porter. He has a small plate today, because greens are a penny more than potatoes, and he had 2 breads yesterday, with the additional enormity of a cheese the day before. This important point settled, he hangs up his hat. He took it off the moment he sat down, and bespeaks the paper after the next gentleman. If he can get it while he is at dinner, he eats with much greater zest, balancing it against the water bottle, and eating a bit of beef, and reading a line or two, alternately. Exactly at 5 minutes before the hour is up, he produces a shilling, pays the reckoning, carefully deposits the change in his waistcoat pocket, first deducting a penny for the waiter, and returns to the office, from which, if it is not foreign post night, he again sallies forth, in about half an hour. He then walks home, at his usual pace, to his little back room at Islington, where he has his tea, perhaps solacing himself during the meal with the conversation of his landlady's little boy, whom he occasionally rewards with a penny, for solving problems in simple addition. Sometimes, there is a letter or two to take up to his employers, in Russell Square, and then, the wealthy man of business, hearing his voice, calls out from the dining parlour, "Come in, Mr. Smith," and Mr. Smith, putting his hat at the feet of one of the hall chairs, walks timidly in, and being condescendingly desired to sit down, carefully tucks his legs under his chair, and sits at a considerable distance from the table while he drinks a glass of sherry which is poured out for him by the eldest boy, and after drinking which, he backs and slides out of the room, in a state of nervous agitation from which he does not perfectly recover, until he finds himself once more in the Islington Road. Poor, harmless creatures such men are, contented but not happy, broken-spirited and humbled. They may feel no pain, but they never know pleasure. Compare these men with another class of beings who, like them, have neither friend nor companion, but whose position in society is the result of their own choice. These are generally old fellows with white heads and red faces, addicted to port wine and Hessian boots, who from some cause, real or imaginary, generally the former, the excellent reason being that they are rich, and their relations poor, grow suspicious of everybody, and do the misanthropical in chambers, taking great delight in thinking themselves unhappy, and making everybody they come near, miserable. You may see such men as these, anywhere. You will know them at coffee houses by their discontented exclamations and the luxury of their dinners, at theatres, by their always sitting in the same place and looking with a jaundiced eye on all the young people near them, at church, by the pomposity with which they enter, and the loud tone in which they repeat the responses, at parties, by their getting cross at whist and hating music. An old fellow of this kind will have his chambers splendidly furnished, and collect books, plate, and pictures about him in profusion, not so much for his own gratification, as to be superior to those who have the desire, but not the means, to compete with him. He belongs to 2 or 3 clubs, and is envied, and flattered, and hated by the members of them all. Sometimes he will be appealed to by a poor relation, a married nephew perhaps, for some little assistance, and then he will declaim with honest indignation on the improvidence of young married people, the worthlessness of a wife, the insolence of having a family, the atrocity of getting into debt with £125 a year, and other unpardonable crimes, winding up his exhortations with a complacent review of his own conduct, and a delicate allusion to parochial relief. He dies, some day after dinner, of apoplexy, having bequeathed his property to a public society, and the institution erects a tablet to his memory, expressive of their admiration of his Christian conduct in this world, and their comfortable conviction of his happiness in the next. But, next to our very particular friends, hackney coachmen, cabmen and cads, whom we admire in proportion to the extent of their cool impudence and perfect self-possession, there is no class of people who amuse us more than London apprentices. They are no longer an organized body, bound down by solemn compact to terrify His Majesty's subjects whenever it pleases them to take offence in their heads and staves in their hands. They are only bound, now, by indentures, and, as to their valour, it is easily restrained by the wholesome dread of the new police, and a perspective view of a damp station house, terminating in a police office and a reprimand. They are still, however, a peculiar class, and not the less pleasant for being inoffensive. Can anyone fail to have noticed them in the streets on Sunday? And were there ever such harmless efforts at the grand and magnificent as the young fellows display? We walked down the Strand, a Sunday or 2 ago, behind a little group, and they furnished food for our amusement the whole way. They had come out of some part of the city. It was between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were on their way to the park. There were 4 of them, all arm in arm, with white kid gloves like so many bridegrooms, light trousers of unprecedented patterns, and coats for which the English language has yet no name, a kind of cross between a greatcoat and a surtout, with the collar of the one, the skirts of the other, and pockets peculiar to themselves. Each of the gentlemen carried a thick stick, with a largest tassel at the top, which he occasionally twirled gracefully round, and the whole 4, by way of looking easy and unconcerned, were walking with a paralytic swagger irresistibly ludicrous. One of the party had a watch about the size and shape of a reasonable ribstone pippin, jammed into his waistcoat pocket, which he carefully compared with the clocks at St. Clement's and the New Church, the illuminated clock at Exeter Change, the clock of St. Martin's Church, and the clock of the Horse Guards. When they at last arrived in St. James's Park, the member of the party who had the best made boots on, hired a second chair expressly for his feet, and flung himself on this 2-pennyworth of sylvan luxury with an air which levelled all distinctions between Brookses and Snookses, Crockfords and Bagnage Wells. We may smile at such people, but they can never excite our anger. They are usually on the best terms with themselves, and it follows almost as a matter of course, in good humour with everyone about them. Besides, they are always the faint reflection of higher lights, and, if they do display a little occasional foolery in their own proper persons, it is surely more tolerable than precocious puppyism in the Quadrant, whiskered dandyism in Regent Street and Pall Mall, or gallantry in its dotage anywhere. Chapter 2. A Christmas Dinner. Christmas time. That man must be a misanthrope indeed, in whose breast something like a jovial feeling is not roused, in whose mind some pleasant associations are not awakened by the recurrence of Christmas. There are people who will tell you that Christmas is not to them what it used to be, that each succeeding Christmas has found some cherished hope, or happy prospect, of the year before, dimmed or passed away, that the present only serves to remind them of reduced circumstances and straitened incomes, of the feasts they once bestowed on hollow friends, and of the cold looks that meet them now, in adversity and misfortune. Never heed such dismal reminiscences. There are few men who have lived long enough in the world, who cannot call up such thoughts any day in the year. Then do not select the merriest of the 365 for your doleful recollections, but draw your chair nearer the blazing fire, fill the glass and send round the song, and if your room be smaller than it was a dozen years ago, or if your glass be filled with reeking punch, instead of sparkling wine, put a good face on the matter, and empty it offhand, and fill another, and troll off the old ditty you used to sing, and thank God it's no worse. Look on the merry faces of your children, if you have any, as they sit round the fire. One little seat may be empty, one slight form that gladdened the father's heart, and roused the mother's pride to look upon, may not be there. Dwell not upon the past, think not that one short year ago, the fair child now resolving into dust, sat before you, with the bloom of health upon its cheek, and the gaiety of infancy in its joyous eye. Reflect upon your present blessings, of which every man has many, not on your past misfortunes, of which all men have some. Fill your glass again, with a merry face and contented heart. Our life on it, but your Christmas shall be merry, and your New Year a happy one. Who can be insensible to the outpourings of good feeling, and the honest interchange of affectionate attachment, which abound at this season of the year? A Christmas family party. We know nothing in nature more delightful. There seems a magic in the very name of Christmas. Petty jealousies and discords are forgotten, social feelings are awakened, in bosoms to which they have long been strangers, father and son, or brother and sister, who have met and passed with averted gaze, or a look of cold recognition, for months before, proffer and return the cordial embrace, and bury their past animosities in their present happiness. Kindly hearts that have yearned towards each other, but have been withheld by false notions of pride and self-dignity, are again reunited, and all is kindness and benevolence. Would that Christmas lasted the whole year through, as it ought, and that the prejudices and passions which deform our better nature, were never called into action among those to whom they should ever be strangers. The Christmas family party that we mean, is not a mere assemblage of relations, got up at a week or two's notice, originating this year, having no family precedent in the last, and not likely to be repeated in the next. No. It is an annual gathering of all the accessible members of the family, young or old, rich or poor, and all the children look forward to it, for 2 months beforehand, in a fever of anticipation. Formerly, it was held at Grandpapa's, but Grandpapa getting old, and Grandmama getting old too, and rather infirm, they have given up housekeeping, and domesticated themselves with Uncle George, so, the party always takes place at Uncle George's house, but Grandmama sends in most of the good things, and Grandpapa always will toddle down, all the way to Newgate Market, to buy the turkey, which he engages a porter to bring home behind him in triumph, always insisting on the man's being rewarded with a glass of spirits, over and above his hire, to drink a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to Aunt George. As to Grandmama, she is very secret and mysterious for 2 or 3 days beforehand, but not sufficiently so, to prevent rumors getting afloat that she has purchased a beautiful new cap with pink ribbons for each of the servants, together with sundry books, and pen knives, and pencil cases, for the younger branches, to say nothing of divers secret additions to the order originally given by Aunt George at the pastry cook's, such as another dozen of mince pies for the dinner, and a large plum cake for the children. On Christmas Eve, Grandmama is always in excellent spirits, and after employing all the children, during the day, in stoning the plums, and all that, insists, regularly every year, on Uncle George coming down into the kitchen, taking off his coat, and stirring the pudding for half an hour or so, which Uncle George good-humoredly does, to the vociferous delight of the children and servants. The evening concludes with a glorious game of blind man's buff, in an early stage of which Grandpapa takes great care to be caught, in order that he may have an opportunity of displaying his dexterity. On the following morning, the old couple, with as many of the children as the pew will hold, go to church in great state, leaving Aunt George at home dusting decanters and filling casters, and Uncle George carrying bottles into the dining parlor, and calling for corkscrews, and getting into everybody's way. When the church party return to lunch, Grandpapa produces a small sprig of mistletoe from his pocket, and tempts the boys to kiss their little cousins under it, a proceeding which affords both the boys and the old gentleman unlimited satisfaction, but which rather outrages Grandmamma's ideas of decorum, until Grandpapa says, that when he was just 13 years and 3 months old, he kissed Grandmamma under a mistletoe too, on which the children clap their hands, and laugh very heartily, as do Aunt George and Uncle George, and Grandmamma looks pleased, and says, with a benevolent smile, that Grandpapa was an impudent young dog, on which the children laugh very heartily again, and Grandpapa more heartily than any of them. But all these diversions are nothing to the subsequent excitement when Grandmamma in a high cap, and slate-colored silk gown, and Grandpapa with a beautifully plaited shirt frill, and white neckerchief, seat themselves on one side of the drawing-room fire, with Uncle George's children and little cousins innumerable, seated in the front, waiting the arrival of the expected visitors. Suddenly a hackney coach is heard to stop, and Uncle George, who has been looking out of the window, exclaims, "Here's Jane!" On which the children rush to the door, and helter-skelter downstairs, and Uncle Robert and Aunt Jane, and the dear little baby, and the nurse, and the whole party, are ushered upstairs amidst tumultuous shouts of "Oh, my!" from the children, and frequently repeated warnings not to hurt baby from the nurse. And Grandpapa takes the child, and Grandmamma kisses her daughter, and the confusion of this first entry has scarcely subsided, when some other aunts and uncles with more cousins arrive, and the grown-up cousins flirt with each other, and so do the little cousins too, for that matter, and nothing is to be heard but a confused din of talking, laughing, and merriment. A hesitating double knock at the street door, heard during a momentary pause in the conversation, excites a general inquiry of "Who's that?" And 2 or 3 children, who have been standing at the window, announce in a low voice, that it's poor Aunt Margaret. Upon which, Aunt George leaves the room to welcome the newcomer, and Grandmamma draws herself up, rather stiff and stately, for Margaret married a poor man without her consent, and poverty not being a sufficiently weighty punishment for her offense, has been discarded by her friends, and debarred the society of her dearest relatives. But Christmas has come round, and the unkind feelings that have struggled against better dispositions during the year, have melted away before its genial influence, like half-formed ice beneath the morning sun. It is not difficult in a moment of angry feeling for a parent to denounce a disobedient child, but, to banish her at a period of general goodwill and hilarity, from the hearth, round which she has sat on so many anniversaries of the same day, expanding by slow degrees from infancy to girlhood, and then bursting, almost imperceptibly, into a woman, is widely different. The air of conscious rectitude, and cold forgiveness, which the old lady has assumed, sits still upon her, and when the poor girl is led in by her sister, pale in looks and broken in hope, not from poverty, for that she could bear, but from the consciousness of undeserved neglect, and unmerited unkindness, it is easy to see how much of it is assumed. A momentary pause succeeds, the girl breaks suddenly from her sister and throws herself, sobbing, on her mother's neck. The father steps hastily forward, and takes her husband's hand. Friends crowd round to offer their hearty congratulations, and happiness and harmony again prevail. As to the dinner, it's perfectly delightful, nothing goes wrong, and everybody is in the very best of spirits, and disposed to please and be pleased. Grandpapa relates a circumstantial account of the purchase of the turkey, with a slight digression relative to the purchase of previous turkeys, on former Christmas days, which Grandmamma corroborates in the minutest particular. Uncle George tells stories, and carves poultry, and takes wine, and jokes with the children at the side table, and winks at the cousins that are making love, or being made love to, and exhilarates everybody with his good humor and hospitality, and when, at last, a stout servant staggers in with a gigantic pudding, with a sprig of holly in the top, there is such a laughing, and shouting, and clapping of little chubby hands, and kicking up of fat dumpy legs, as can only be equalled by the applause with which the astonishing feat of pouring lighted brandy into mince pies, is received by the younger visitors. Then the dessert and the wine and the fun. Such beautiful speeches, and such songs, from Aunt Margaret's husband, who turns out to be such a nice man, and so attentive to Grandmamma. Even Grandpapa not only sings his annual song with unprecedented vigor, but on being honored with an unanimous encore, according to annual custom, actually comes out with a new one which nobody but Grandmamma ever heard before, and a young scapegrace of a cousin, who has been in some disgrace with the old people, for certain heinous sins of omission and commission, neglecting to call, and persisting in drinking Burton ale, astonishes everybody into convulsions of laughter by volunteering the most extraordinary comic songs that ever were heard. And thus the evening passes, in a strain of rational goodwill and cheerfulness, doing more to awaken the sympathies of every member of the party in behalf of his neighbor, and to perpetuate their good feeling during the ensuing year, than half the homilies that have ever been written, by half the divines that have ever lived. Chapter 3 The New Year. Next to Christmas Day, the most pleasant annual epoch in existence is the advent of the New Year. There are a lachrymose set of people who usher in the New Year with watching and fasting, as if they were bound to attend as chief mourners at the obsequies of the old one. Now, we cannot but think it a great deal more complimentary, both to the old year that has rolled away, and to the new year that is just beginning to dawn upon us, to see the old fellow out, and the new one in, with gaiety and glee. There must have been some few occurrences in the past year to which we can look back, with a smile of cheerful recollection, if not with a feeling of heartfelt thankfulness. And we are bound by every rule of justice and equity to give the new year credit for being a good one, until he proves himself unworthy the confidence we repose in him. This is our view of the matter, and entertaining it, notwithstanding our respect for the old year, one of the few remaining moments of whose existence passes away with every word we write, here we are, seated by our fireside on this last night of the old year, 1836, penning this article with as jovial a face as if nothing extraordinary had happened, or was about to happen, to disturb our good humor. Hackney coaches and carriages keep rattling up the street and down the street in rapid succession, conveying, doubtless, smartly dressed coachfuls to crowded parties. Loud and repeated double knocks at the house with green blinds, opposite, announced to the whole neighborhood that there's one large party in the street at all events, and we saw through the window, and through the fog too, till it grew so thick that we rung for candles, and drew our curtains, pastry cooks men with green boxes on their heads, and rout furniture warehouse carts, with cane seats and French lamps, hurrying to the numerous houses where an annual festival is held in honor of the occasion. We can fancy one of these parties, we think, as well as if we were duly dress-coated and pumped, and had just been announced at the drawing-room door. Take the house with the green blinds for instance. We know it is a quadrille party, because we saw some men taking up the front drawing-room carpet while we sat at breakfast this morning, and if further evidence be required, and we must tell the truth, we just now saw one of the young ladies doing another of the young ladies' hair, near one of the bedroom windows, in an unusual style of splendor, which nothing else but a quadrille party could possibly justify. The master of the house with the green blinds is in a public office. We know the fact by the cut of his coat, the tie of his neckcloth, and the self-satisfaction of his gait. The very green blinds themselves have a Somerset House air about them. Hark! A cab. That's a junior clerk in the same office, a tidy sort of young man, with a tendency to cold and corns, who comes in a pair of boots with black cloth fronts, and brings his shoes in his coat pocket, which shoes he is at this very moment putting on in the hall. Now he is announced by the man in the passage to another man in a blue coat, who is a disguised messenger from the office. The man on the first landing precedes him to the drawing-room door. "Mr. Tupple," shouts the messenger. "How are you, Tupple?" says the master of the house, advancing from the fire, before which he has been talking politics and airing himself. "My dear, this is Mr. Tupple." A courteous salute from the lady of the house. "Tupple, my eldest daughter, Julia, my dear, Mr. Tupple, Tupple, my other daughters, my son, sir." Tupple rubs his hands very hard, and smiles as if it were all capital fun, and keeps constantly bowing and turning himself round, till the whole family have been introduced, when he glides into a chair at the corner of the sofa, and opens a miscellaneous conversation with the young ladies upon the weather, and the theatres, and the old year, and the last new murder, and the balloon, and the ladies' sleeves, and the festivities of the season, and a great many other topics of small talk. More double knocks. What an extensive party! What an incessant hum of conversation and general sipping of coffee! We see Tupple now, in our mind's eye, in the height of his glory. He has just handed that stout old lady's cup to the servant, and now, he dives among the crowd of young men by the door, to intercept the other servant, and secure a muffin plate for the old lady's daughter, before he leaves the room, and now, as he passes the sofa on his way back, he bestows a glance of recognition and patronage upon the young ladies as condescending and familiar as if he had known them from infancy. Charming person Mr. Tupple, perfect ladies' man, such a delightful companion, too. Laugh! Nobody ever understood Papa's jokes half so well as Mr. Tupple, who laughs himself into convulsions at every fresh burst of facetiousness. Most delightful partner. Talks through the whole set. And although he does seem at first rather gay and frivolous, so romantic and with so much feeling. Quite a love. No great favorite with the young men, certainly, who sneer at, and affect to despise him, but everybody knows that's only envy, and they needn't give themselves the trouble to depreciate his merits at any rate, for Ma says he shall be asked to every future dinner party, if it's only to talk to people between the courses, and distract their attention when there's any unexpected delay in the kitchen. At supper, Mr. Tupple shows to still greater advantage than he has done throughout the evening, and when Pa requests everyone to fill their glasses for the purpose of drinking happiness throughout the year, Mr. Tupple is so droll, insisting on all the young ladies having their glasses filled, notwithstanding their repeated assurances that they never can, by any possibility, think of emptying them, and subsequently begging permission to say a few words on the sentiment which has just been uttered by Pa when he makes one of the most brilliant and poetical speeches that can possibly be imagined, about the old year and the new one. After the toast has been drunk, and when the ladies have retired, Mr. Tupple requests that every gentleman will do him the favor of filling his glass, for he has a toast to propose, on which all the gentlemen cry "Here! Here!" and pass the decanters accordingly, and Mr. Tupple, being informed by the master of the house that they are all charged, and waiting for his toast, rises, and begs to remind the gentlemen present how much they have been delighted by the dazzling array of elegance and beauty which the drawing-room has exhibited that night, and how their senses have been charmed, and their hearts captivated, by the bewitching concentration of female loveliness which that very room has so recently displayed. Loud cries of "Here!" much as he, Tupple, would be disposed to deplore the absence of the ladies, on other grounds, he cannot but derive some consolation from the reflection that the very circumstance of their not being present, enables him to propose a toast, which he would have otherwise been prevented from giving. That toast he begs to say is "The ladies." Great applause. The ladies, among whom the fascinating daughters of their excellent host, are alike conspicuous for their beauty, their accomplishments, and their elegance. He begs them to drain a bumper to the ladies, and a Happy New Year to them. Prolonged approbation, above which the noise of the ladies dancing the Spanish dance among themselves, overhead, is distinctly audible. The applause consequent on this toast, has scarcely subsided, when a young gentleman in a pink under-waistcoat, sitting towards the bottom of the table, is observed to grow very restless and fidgety, and to evince strong indications of some latent desire to give vent to his feelings in a speech, which the wary Tupple, at once perceiving, determines to forestall by speaking himself. He, therefore, rises again, with an air of solemn importance, and trusts he may be permitted to propose another toast, unqualified approbation, and Mr. Tupple proceeds. He is sure they must all be deeply impressed with the hospitality, he may say the splendor with which they have been that night received by their worthy host and hostess. Unbounded applause, although this is the first occasion on which he has had the pleasure and delight of sitting at that board. He has known his friend Double long and intimately, he has been connected with him in business. He wishes everybody present knew Double as well as he does. A cough from the host, he, Tupple, can lay his hand upon his, Tupple's, heart, and declare his confident belief that a better man, a better husband, a better father, a better brother, a better son, a better relation in any relation of life, than Double, never existed. Loud cries of "Here!" They have seen him tonight in the peaceful bosom of his family, they should see him in the morning, in the trying duties of his office. Calm in the perusal of the morning papers, uncompromising in the signature of his name, dignified in his replies to the inquiries of stranger applicants, deferential in his behavior to his superiors, majestic in his deportment to the messengers. Cheers, when he bears this merited testimony to the excellent qualities of his friend Double. What can he say in approaching such a subject as Mrs. Double? Is it requisite for him to expatiate on the qualities of that amiable woman? No, he will spare his friend Double's feelings. He will spare the feelings of his friend if he will allow him to have the honor of calling him so. Mr. Double, Jr. Here Mr. Double, Jr., who has been previously distending his mouth to a considerable width, by thrusting a particularly fine orange into that feature, suspends operations, and assumes a proper appearance of intense melancholy. He will simply say, and he is quite certain it is a sentiment in which all who hear him will readily concur, that his friend Double is as superior to any man he ever knew, as Mrs. Double is far beyond any woman he ever saw, except her daughters, and he will conclude by proposing their worthy host and hostess, and may they live to enjoy many more New Years. The toast is drunk with acclamation, Double returns thanks, and the whole party rejoin the ladies in the drawing-room. Young men who were too bashful to dance before supper, find tongues and partners. The musicians exhibit unequivocal symptoms of having drunk the New Year in, while the company were out, and dancing is kept up until far in the first morning of the New Year. We have scarcely written the last word of the previous sentence, when the first stroke of 12 peals from the neighboring churches. There certainly, we must confess, it now is something awful in the sound. Strictly speaking, it may not be more impressive now than at any other time, for the hours steal as swiftly on, at other periods, and their flight is little heeded. But, we measure man's life by years, and it is a solemn knell that warns us we have passed another of the landmarks which stands between us and the grave. Disguise it as we may, the reflection will force itself on our minds, that when the next bell announces the arrival of a new year, we may be insensible alike of the timely warning we have so often neglected, and of all the warm feelings that glow within us now. Chapter 4 Miss Evans and the Eagle. Mr. Samuel Wilkins was a carpenter, a journeyman carpenter of small dimensions, decidedly below the middle size bordering, perhaps, upon the dwarfish. His face was round and shining, and his hair carefully twisted into the outer corner of each eye, till it formed a variety of that description of semi-curls, usually known as aigrewatters. His earnings were all sufficient for his wants, varying from 18 shillings to £1.5, weekly. His manner undeniable, his Sabbath waistcoat dazzling. No wonder that, with these qualifications, Samuel Wilkins found favour in the eyes of the other sex. Many women have been captivated by far less substantial qualifications. But, Samuel was proof against their blandishments, until at length his eyes rested on those of a being for whom, from that time forth, he felt fate had destined him. He came, and conquered, proposed, and was accepted, loved, and was beloved. Mr. Wilkins kept company with Jemima Evans, Miss Evans, or Ivans, to adopt the pronunciation most in vogue with her circle of acquaintance, had adopted in early life the useful pursuit of shoe-binding, to which she had afterwards superadded the occupation of a straw-bonnet maker. Herself, her maternal parent, and 2 sisters, formed an harmonious quartet in the most secluded portion of Camden Town, and here it was that Mr. Wilkins presented himself, one Monday afternoon, in his best attire, with his face more shining and his waistcoat more bright than either had ever appeared before. The family were just going to tea, and were so glad to see him. It was quite a little feast, 2 ounces of 7 and 6penny green, and a quarter of a pound of the best fresh, and Mr. Wilkins had brought a pint of shrimps, neatly folded up in a clean belcher, to give a zest to the meal, and propitiate Mrs. Ivans. Jemima was cleaning herself upstairs, so Mr. Samuel Wilkins sat down and talked domestic economy with Mrs. Ivans, whilst the 2 youngest Miss Ivanses poked bits of lighted brown paper between the bars under the kettle, to make the water boil for tea. "I was a-thinking," said Mr. Samuel Wilkins, during a pause in the conversation, "I was a-thinking of taking Jemima to the Eagle tonight." "Oh my!" exclaimed Mrs. Ivans. "Law! How nice!" said the youngest Miss Ivans. "Well, I declare," added the youngest Miss Ivans but one. "Tell Jemima to put on her white muslin, Tilly," screamed Mrs. Ivans, with motherly anxiety, and down came Jemima herself soon afterwards in the white muslin gown carefully hooked and eyed, a little red shawl, plentifully pinned, a white straw bonnet trimmed with red ribbons, a small necklace, a large pair of bracelets, Denmark satin shoes, and open-worked stockings, white cotton gloves on her fingers, and a cambric pocket handkerchief, carefully folded up, in her hand, all quite genteel and ladylike. And away went Miss Jemima Ivans and Mr. Samuel Wilkins, and a dress cane, with a gilt knob at the top, to the admiration and envy of the street in general, and to the high gratification of Mrs. Ivans, and the 2 youngest Miss Ivanses in particular. They had no sooner turned into the Pancras Road, than who should Miss Jemima Ivans stumble upon, by the most fortunate accident in the world, but a young lady as she knew, with her young man! And it is so strange how things do turn out sometimes. They were actually going to the Eagle too. So Mr. Samuel Wilkins was introduced to Miss Jemima Ivans's friend's young man, and they all walked on together, talking, and laughing, and joking away like anything, and when they got as far as Pentonville, Miss Ivans's friend's young man would have the ladies go into the Crown, to taste some shrub, which, after a great blushing and giggling, and hiding of faces in elaborate pocket handkerchiefs, they consented to do. Having tasted it once, they were easily prevailed upon to taste it again, and they sat out in the garden tasting shrub, and looking at the buses alternately, till it was just the proper time to go to the Eagle, and then they resumed their journey, and walked very fast, for fear they should lose the beginning of the concert in the rotunda. "How heavenly!" said Miss Jemima Ivans, and Miss Jemima Ivans's friend, both at once, when they had passed the gate and were fairly inside the gardens. There were the walks, beautifully gravelled and planted, and the refreshment boxes, painted and ornamented like so many snuff boxes, and the variegated lamps shedding their rich light upon the company's heads, and the place for dancing ready chalked for the company's feet, and a Moorish band playing at one end of the gardens and an opposition military band playing away at the other. Then, the waiters were rushing to and fro with glasses of negus, and glasses of brandy and water, and bottles of ale, and bottles of stout, and ginger beer was going off in one place, and practical jokes were going on in another, and people were crowding to the door of the rotunda, and in short the whole scene was, as Miss Jemima Ivins, inspired by the novelty, or the shrub, or both, observed, one of dazzling excitement. As to the concert room, never was anything half so splendid. There was an orchestra for the singers, all paint, gilding, and plate glass, and such an organ. Miss Jemima Ivins's friend's young man whispered it had cost £400, which Mr. Samuel Wilkins said was not dear neither, an opinion in which the ladies perfectly coincided. The audience was seated on elevated benches round the room, and crowded into every part of it, and everybody was eating and drinking as comfortably as possible. Just before the concert commenced, Mr. Samuel Wilkins ordered 2 glasses of rum and water warm with and 2 slices of lemon, for himself and the other young man, together with a pint of sherry wine for the ladies, and some sweet caraway seed biscuits, and they would have been quite comfortable and happy, only a strange gentleman with large whiskers would stare at Miss Jemima Ivins, and another gentleman in a plaid waistcoat would wink at Miss Jemima Ivins's friend, on which Miss Jemima Ivins's friend's younger man exhibited symptoms of boiling over, and began to mutter about people's imperance, and swells out "oh luck," and to intimate, in oblique terms, a vague intention of knocking somebody's head off, which he was only prevented from announcing more emphatically, by both Miss Jemima Ivins and her friend threatening to faint away on the spot if he said another word. The concert commenced, overture on the organ. "How solemn!" exclaimed Miss Jemima Ivins, glancing, perhaps unconsciously, at the gentleman with the whiskers. Mr. Samuel Wilkins, who had been muttering apart for some time past, as if he were holding a confidential conversation with the gilt knob of the dress cane, breathed hard, breathing vengeance, perhaps, but said nothing. The soldier tired, Miss Somebody in white satin. "Encore!" cried Miss Jemima Ivins's friend. "Encore!" shouted the gentleman in the plaid waistcoat immediately, hammering the table with a stout bottle. Miss Jemima Ivins's friend's younger man eyed the man behind the waistcoat from head to foot, and cast a look of interrogative contempt towards Mr. Samuel Wilkins. Comic song, accompanied on the organ. Miss Jemima Ivins was convulsed with laughter, so was the man with the whiskers. Everything the ladies did, the plaid waistcoat and whiskers did, by way of expressing unity of sentiment and congeniality of soul, and Miss Jemima Ivins, and Miss Jemima Ivins's friend, grew lively and talkative, as Mr. Samuel Wilkins, and Miss Jemima Ivins's friend's young man, grew morose and surly in inverse proportion. Now, if the matter had ended here, the little party might soon have recovered their former equanimity, but Mr. Samuel Wilkins and his friend began to throw looks of defiance upon the waistcoat and whiskers. And the waistcoat and whiskers, by way of intimating the slight degree in which they were affected by the looks aforesaid, bestowed glances of increased admiration upon Miss Jemima Ivins and friend. The concert and vaudeville concluded. They promenaded the gardens. The waistcoat and whiskers did the same, and made divers remarks complimentary to the ankles of Miss Jemima Ivins and friend, in an audible tone. At length, not satisfied with these numerous atrocities, they actually came up and asked Miss Jemima Ivins, and Miss Jemima Ivins's friend, to dance, without taking no more notice of Mr. Samuel Wilkins, and Miss Jemima Ivins's friend's young man, than if they was nobody. "What do you mean by that, scoundrel?" exclaimed Mr. Samuel Wilkins, grasping the gilt knob of dress cane firmly in his right hand. "What's the matter with you, you little humbug?" replied the whiskers. "How dare you insult me and my friend?" inquired the friend's young man. "You and your friend be hanged," responded the waistcoat. "Take that," exclaimed Mr. Samuel Wilkins. The ferrule of the gilt knob of dress cane was visible for an instant, and then the light of the variegated lamps shone brightly upon it as it whirled into the air, cane and all. "Give it him," said the waistcoat. "Horficer!" screamed the ladies. Miss Jemima Ivins's beau, and the friend's young man, lay gasping on the gravel, and the waistcoat and whiskers were seen no more. Miss Jemima Ivins and friend, being conscious that the affray was in no slight degree attributable to themselves, of course went into hysterics forthwith, declared themselves the most injured of women, exclaimed, in incoherent ravings, that they had been wrongfully suspected, that they should ever have lived to see the day, and so forth, suffered a relapse every time they opened their eyes and saw their unfortunate little admirers, and were carried to their respective abodes in a hackney coach, and a state of insensibility, compounded of shrub, sherry, and excitement. Chapter 5. The Parlour Orator. We had been lounging one evening, down Oxford Street, Holborn, Cheapside, Coleman Street, Finsbury Square, and so on, with the intention of returning westward, by Pentonville and the New Road, when we began to feel rather thirsty, and disposed to rest for 5 or 10 minutes. So, we turned back towards an old, quiet, decent public house, which we remembered to have passed but a moment before. It was not far from the city road, for the purpose of solacing ourselves with a glass of ale. The house was none of your stuccoed, French-polished, illuminated palaces, but a modest public house of the old school, with a little old bar, and a little old landlord, who, with a wife and daughter of the same pattern, was comfortably seated in the bar aforesaid, a snug little room with a cheerful fire, protected by a large screen, from behind which the young lady emerged on our representing our inclination for a glass of ale. "Won't you walk into the parlour, sir?" said the young lady, in seductive tones. "You had better walk into the parlour, sir," said the little old landlord, throwing his chair back, and looking round one side of the screen, to survey our appearance. "You had much better step into the parlour, sir," said the little old lady, popping out her head. On the other side of the screen, we cast a slight glance around, as if to express our ignorance of the locality so much recommended. The little old landlord observed it, bustled out of the small door of the small bar, and forthwith ushered us into the parlour itself. It was an ancient, dark-looking room, with oaken wainscoting, a sanded floor, and a high mantelpiece. The walls were ornamented with 3 or 4 old coloured prints in black frames, each print representing a naval engagement, with a couple of men of war banging away at each other most vigorously, while another vessel or 2 were blowing up in the distance, and the foreground presented a miscellaneous collection of broken masts and blue legs sticking up out of the water. Depending from the ceiling in the centre of the room, were a gaslight and belt pull. On each side were 3 or 4 long narrow tables, behind which was a thickly planted row of those slippery, shiny-looking wooden chairs, peculiar to hostelries of this description. The monotonous appearance of the sanded boards was relieved by an occasional spittoon, and a triangular pile of those useful articles adorned the 2 upper corners of the apartment. At the furthest table, nearest the fire, with his face towards the door at the bottom of the room, sat a stoutish man of about 40, whose short, stiff, black hair curled closely round a broad high forehead, and a face to which something besides water and exercise had communicated a rather inflamed appearance. He was smoking a cigar, with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and had that confident oracular air which marked him as the leading politician, general authority, and universal anecdote relater, of the place. He had evidently just delivered himself of something very weighty, for the remainder of the company were puffing at their respective pipes and cigars in a kind of solemn abstraction, as if quite overwhelmed with the magnitude of the subject recently under discussion. On his right hand sat an elderly gentleman with a white head, and broad-brimmed brown hat. On his left, a sharp-nosed, light-haired man in a brown surtout reaching nearly to his heels, who took a whiff at his pipe, and an admiring glance at the red-faced man, alternately. "Very extraordinary," said the light-haired man after a pause of 5 minutes. A murmur of assent ran through the company. "Not at all extraordinary, not at all," said the red-faced man, awakening suddenly from his reverie, and turning upon the light-haired man, the moment he had spoken. "Why should it be extraordinary? Why is it extraordinary? Prove it to be extraordinary." "Oh, if you come to that," said the light-haired man, meekly. "Come to that," ejaculated the man with the red face. "But we must come to that. We stand, in these times, upon a calm elevation of intellectual attainment, and not in the dark recess of mental deprivation. Proof is what I require, proof, and not assertions, in these stirring times. Every gentleman that knows me, knows what was the nature and effect of my observations, when it was in the contemplation of the Old Street Suburban Representative Discovery Society, to recommend a candidate for that place in Cornwall. I forget the name of it. Mr. Snowby, said Mr. Wilson, is a fit and proper person to represent the borough in Parliament. Prove it, says I. He is a friend to reform, says Mr. Wilson. Prove it, says I. The abolitionist of the national debt, the unflinching opponent of pensions, the uncompromising advocate of the Negro, the reducer of sinecures and the duration of parliaments, the extender of nothing but the suffrages of the people, says Mr. Wilson. Prove it, says I. His acts prove it, says he. Prove them, says I. And he could not prove them, said the red-faced man, looking round triumphantly, and the borough didn't have him, and if you carried this principle to the full extent, you'd have no debt, no pensions, no sinecures, no Negroes, no nothing. And then, standing upon an elevation of intellectual attainment, and having reached the summit of popular prosperity, you might bid defiance to the nations of the earth, and erect yourselves in the proud confidence of wisdom and superiority. This is my argument. This always has been my argument, and if I was a member of the House of Commons tomorrow, I'd make 'em shake in their shoes with it." And the red-faced man, having struck the table very hard with his clenched fist, to add weight to the declaration, smoked away like a brewery. "Well," said the sharp-nosed man, in a very slow and soft voice, addressing the company in general, "I always do say, that of all the gentlemen I have the pleasure of meeting in this room, there is not one whose conversation I like to hear so much as Mr. Rogers's, or who is such improving company," said Mr. Rogers, for that, it seemed, was the name of the red-faced man. "You may say I am improving company, for I've improved you all to some purpose, though as to my conversation being as my friend Mr. Ellis here describes it, that is not for me to say anything about. You, gentlemen, are the best judges on that point, but this I will say, when I came into this parish, and first chose this room, 10 years ago, I don't believe there was one man in it, who knew he was a slave, and now you all that know it, and writhe under it. Inscribe that upon my tomb, and I am satisfied." "Why, as to inscribing it on your tomb," said a little greengrocer with a chubby face, "of course you can have anything chalked up, as you likes to pay for, so far as it relates to yourself and your affairs, but, when you come to talk about slaves, and that their abuse, you'd better keep it in the family, 'cause I for one don't like to be called them names, night after night." "You are a slave," said the red-faced man, "and the most pitiable of all slaves." "Very hard if I am," interrupted the greengrocer, "for I got no good out of the 20 million that was paid for emancipation, anyhow." "A willing slave," ejaculated the red-faced man, getting more red with eloquence, "and contradiction, resigning the dearest birthright of your children, neglecting the sacred call of liberty, who, standing imploringly before you, appeals to the warmest feelings of your heart, and points to your helpless infants, but in vain." "Prove it," said the greengrocer. "Prove it," sneered the man with the red face. "What? Bending beneath the yoke of an insolent and factious oligarchy, bowed down by the domination of cruel laws, groaning beneath tyranny and oppression on every hand, at every side, and in every corner. Prove it! The red-faced man abruptly broke off, sneered melodramatically, and buried his countenance and his indignation together, in a quart pot. To be sure, Mr. Rogers, said a stout broker in a large waistcoat, who had kept his eyes fixed on this luminary all the time he was speaking. To be sure, said the broker with a sigh, that's the point. Of course, said divers members of the company, who understood almost as much about the matter as the broker himself. You had better let him alone, Tommy, said the broker, by way of advice to the little greengrocer. He can tell what's o'clock by an 8-day, without looking at the minute hand. He can. Try it on some other suit. It won't do with him. Tommy, what is a man? Continued the red-faced specimen of the species, jerking his hat indignantly from its peg on the wall. What is an Englishman? Is he to be trampled upon by every oppressor? Is he to be knocked down at everybody's bidding? What's freedom? Not a standing army. What's a standing army? Not freedom. What's general happiness? Not universal misery. Liberty ain't the window tax, is it? The Lords ain't the Commons, are they? And the red-faced man, gradually bursting into a radiating sentence, in which such adjectives as dastardly, oppressive, violent, and sanguinary, formed the most conspicuous words, knocked his hat indignantly over his eyes, left the room, and slammed the door after him. Wonderful man, said he of the sharp nose. Splendid speaker, added the broker. Great power, said everybody but the greengrocer. And as they said it, the whole party shook their heads mysteriously, and one by one retired, leaving us alone in the old parlor. If we had followed the established precedent in all such instances, we should have fallen into a fit of musing, without delay. The ancient appearance of the room, the old paneling of the wall, the chimney blackened with smoke and age, would have carried us back 100 years at least, and we should have gone dreaming on, until the pewter pot on the table, or the little beer chiller on the fire, had started into life, and addressed to us a long story of days gone by. But, by some means or other, we were not in a romantic humor, and although we tried very hard to invest the furniture with vitality, it remained perfectly unmoved, obstinate, and sullen. Being thus reduced to the unpleasant necessity of musing about ordinary matters, our thoughts reverted to the red-faced man, and his oratorical display. A numerous race are these red-faced men. There is not a parlor, or club room, or benefit society, or humble party of any kind, without its red-faced man. Weak-pated dolts they are, and a great deal of mischief they do to their cause, however good. So, just to hold a pattern one up, to know the others by, we took his likeness at once, and put him in here. And that is the reason why we have written this paper. Chapter Chapter 6. The Hospital Patient. In our rambles through the streets of London after evening has set in, we often pause beneath the windows of some public hospital, and picture to ourselves the gloomy and mournful scenes that are passing within. The sudden moving of a taper as its feeble ray shoots from window to window, until its light gradually disappears, as if it were carried further back into the room to the bedside of some suffering patient, is enough to awaken a whole crowd of reflections. The mere glimmering of the low burning lamps, which, when all other habitations are wrapped in darkness and slumber, denote the chamber where so many forms are writhing with pain, or wasting with disease, is sufficient to check the most boisterous merriment. Who can tell the anguish of those weary hours, when the only sound the sick man hears, is the disjointed wanderings of some feverish slumberer near him, the low moan of pain, or perhaps the muttered, long-forgotten prayer of a dying man? Who, but they who have felt it, can imagine the sense of loneliness and desolation which must be the portion of those who in the hour of dangerous illness are left to be tended by strangers? For what hands, be they ever so gentle, can wipe the clammy brow, or smooth the restless bed, like those of mother, wife, or child? Impressed with these thoughts, we have turned away, through the nearly deserted streets, and the sight of the few miserable creatures still hovering about them, has not tended to lessen the pain which such meditations awaken. The hospital is a refuge and resting place for hundreds, who but for such institutions must die in the streets and doorways. But what can be the feelings of some outcasts when they are stretched on a bed of sickness with scarcely a hope of recovery? The wretched woman who lingers about the pavement, hours after midnight, and the miserable shadow of a man, the ghastly remnant that want and drunkenness have left, which crouches beneath a window ledge, to sleep where there is some shelter from the rain, have little to bind them to life, but what have they to look back upon, in death? What are the unwonted comforts of a roof and a bed, to them, when the recollections of a whole life of debasement stalk before them, when repentance seems a mockery, and sorrow comes too late? About a 12-month ago, as we were strolling through Covent Garden, we had been thinking about these things overnight. We were attracted by the very prepossessing appearance of a pickpocket, who, having declined to take the trouble of walking to the police office, on the ground that he hadn't the slightest wish to go there at all, was being conveyed thither in a wheelbarrow, to the huge delight of a crowd. Somehow, we never can resist joining a crowd, so we turned back with the mob, and entered the office, in company with our friend the pickpocket, a couple of policemen, and as many dirty-faced spectators as could squeeze their way in. There was a powerful, ill-looking young fellow at the bar, who was undergoing an examination, on the very common charge of having, on the previous night, ill-treated a woman, with whom he lived in some court hard by. Several witnesses bore testimony to acts of the grossest brutality, and a certificate was read from the house surgeon of a neighboring hospital, describing the nature of the injuries the woman had received, and intimating that her recovery was extremely doubtful. Some question appeared to have been raised about the identity of the prisoner, for when it was agreed that the two magistrates should visit the hospital at 8 o'clock that evening, to take her deposition, it was settled that the man should be taken there also. He turned pale at this, and we saw him clench the bar very hard when the order was given. He was removed directly afterwards, and he spoke not a word. We felt an irrepressible curiosity to witness this interview, although it is hard to tell why, at this instant, for we knew it must be a painful one. It was no very difficult matter for us to gain permission, and we obtained it. The prisoner, and the officer who had him in custody, were already at the hospital when we reached it, and waiting the arrival of the magistrates in a small room below stairs. The man was handcuffed, and his hat was pulled forward over his eyes. It was easy to see, though, by the whiteness of his countenance, and the constant twitching of the muscles of his face, that he dreaded what was to come. After a short interval, the magistrates and clerk were bowed in by the house surgeon and a couple of young men who smelt very strong of tobacco smoke. They were introduced as dressers, and after one magistrate had complained bitterly of the cold, and the other of the absence of any news in the evening paper, it was announced that the patient was prepared, and we were conducted to the casualty ward in which he was lying. The dim light which burnt in the spacious room, increased rather than diminished the ghastly appearance of the hapless creatures in the beds, which were ranged in 2 long rows on either side. In one bed, lay a child enveloped in bandages, with its body half consumed by fire. In another, a female, rendered hideous by some dreadful accident, was wildly beating her clenched fists on the coverlet, in pain. On a third, there lay stretched a young girl, apparently in the heavy stupor often the immediate precursor of death. Her face was stained with blood, and her breast and arms were bound up in folds of linen. 2 or 3 of the beds were empty, and their recent occupants were sitting beside them, but with faces so wan, and eyes so bright and glassy, that it was fearful to meet their gaze. On every face was stamped the expression of anguish and suffering. The object of the visit was lying at the upper end of the room. She was a fine young woman of about 2 or 23. Her long black hair, which had been hastily cut from near the wounds on her head, streamed over the pillow in jagged and matted locks. Her face bore deep marks of the ill usage she had received. Her hand was pressed upon her side, as if her chief pain were there. Her breathing was short and heavy, and it was plain to see that she was dying fast. She murmured a few words in reply to the magistrate's inquiry whether she was in great pain, and, having been raised on the pillow by the nurse, looked vacantly upon the strange countenances that surrounded her bed. The magistrate nodded to the officer, to bring the man forward. He did so, and stationed him at the bedside. The girl looked on with a wild and troubled expression of face, but her sight was dim, and she did not know him. "Take off his hat," said the magistrate. The officer did as he was desired, and the man's features were disclosed. The girl started up, with an energy quite preternatural. The fire gleamed in her heavy eyes, and the blood rushed to her pale and sunken cheeks. It was a convulsive effort. She fell back upon her pillow, and covering her scarred and bruised face with her hands, burst into tears. The man cast an anxious look towards her, but otherwise appeared wholly unmoved. After a brief pause the nature of the errand was explained, and the oath tendered. "Oh, no, gentlemen," said the girl, raising herself once more, and folding her hands together. "No, gentlemen, for God's sake. I did it myself. It was nobody's fault. It was an accident. He didn't hurt me. He wouldn't for all the world. Jack, dear Jack, you know you wouldn't." Her sight was fast failing her, and her hand groped over the bedclothes in search of his. Brute as the man was, he was not prepared for this. He turned his face from the bed, and sobbed. The girl's color changed, and her breathing grew more difficult. She was evidently dying. "We respect the feelings which prompt you to this," said the gentleman who had spoken first, "but let me warn you, not to persist in what you know to be untrue, until it is too late. It cannot save him." "Jack," murmured the girl, laying her hand upon his arm, "they shall not persuade me to swear your life away. He didn't do it, gentlemen. He never hurt me." She grasped his arm tightly, and added, in a broken whisper, "I hope God Almighty will forgive me all the wrong I have done, and the life I have led. God bless you, Jack. Some kind gentleman take my love to my poor old father. 5 years ago, he said he wished I had died a child. Oh, I wish I had. I wish I had." The nurse bent over the girl for a few seconds, and then drew the sheet over her face. It covered a corpse. Chapter 7: The Misplaced Attachment of Mr. John Dounce. If we had to make a classification of society, there is a particular kind of men whom we should immediately set down under the head of old boys, and a column of most extensive dimensions the old boys would require. To what precise causes the rapid advance of the old boy population is to be traced, we are unable to determine. It would be an interesting and curious speculation, but, as we have not sufficient space to devote to it here, we simply state the fact that the numbers of the old boys have been gradually augmenting within the last few years, and that they are at this moment alarmingly on the increase. Upon a general review of the subject, and without considering it minutely in detail, we should be disposed to subdivide the old boys into 2 distinct classes: the gay old boys, and the steady old boys. The gay old boys are paunchy old men in the disguise of young ones, who frequent the Quadrant and Regent Street in the daytime, the theatres, especially theatres under lady management, at night, and who assume all the foppishness and levity of boys, without the excuse of youth or inexperience. The steady old boys are certain stout old gentlemen of clean appearance, who are always to be seen in the same taverns, at the same hours every evening, smoking and drinking in the same company. There was once a fine collection of old boys to be seen round the circular table at Offaly's every night, between the hours of 8:30 and 11:30. We have lost sight of them for some time. There were, and maybe still, for aught we know, 2 splendid specimens in full blossom at the Rainbow Tavern in Fleet Street, who always used to sit in the box nearest the fireplace, and smoked long cherry stick pipes which went under the table, with the bowls resting on the floor. Grand old boys they were, fat, red-faced, white-headed old fellows, always the one on one side the table, and the other opposite, puffing and drinking away in great state. Everybody knew them, and it was supposed by some people that they were both immortal. Mr. John Dounce was an old boy of the latter class. We don't mean immortal, but steady, a retired glove and braces maker, a widower, resident with 3 daughters all grown up, and all unmarried in Cursitor Street, Chancery Lane. He was a short, round, large-faced, tubbish sort of man, with a broad-brimmed hat, and a square coat, and had that grave, but confident, kind of roll, peculiar to old boys in general. Regular as clockwork breakfast at 9, dress and titivate a little down to the Sir Somebody's head, a glass of ale and the paper, come back again, and take daughters out for a walk, dinner at 3, glass of grog and pipe nap tea, little walk Sir Somebody's head again, Capitol House, delightful evenings. There were Mr. Harris, the law stationer, and Mr. Jennings, the robe maker, 2 jolly young fellows like himself, and Jones, the barrister's clerk, rum fellow, the Jones Capital Company, full of anecdote! And there they sat every night till just 10 minutes before 12, drinking their brandy and water, and smoking their pipes, and telling stories, and enjoying themselves with a kind of solemn joviality particularly edifying. Sometimes Jones would propose a half-price visit to Drury Lane or Covent Garden, to see 2 acts of a 5-act play, and a new farce, perhaps, or a ballet, on which occasions the whole 4 of them went together, none of your hurrying and nonsense, but having their brandy and water first, comfortably, and ordering a steak and some oysters for their supper against they came back, and then walking coolly into the pit, when the rush had gone in, as all sensible people do, and did when Mr. Downs was a young man, except when the celebrated Master Betty was at the height of his popularity, and then Mr. Downs perfectly well remembered getting a holiday from business, and going to the pit doors at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and waiting there, till 6 in the afternoon, with some sandwiches in a pocket handkerchief and some wine in the phial, and fainting after all, with the heat and fatigue, before the play began, in which situation he was lifted out of the pit, into one of the dress boxes, sir, by 5 of the finest women of that day, sir, who compassionated his situation and administered restoratives, and sent a black servant, 6 foot high, in blue and silver livery, next morning with their compliments, and to know how he found himself, sir, by G. Between the acts Mr. Downs and Mr. Harris, and Mr. Jennings, used to stand up, and look round the house, and Jones, knowing fellow that Jones knew everybody, pointed out the fashionable and celebrated Lady So-and-so in the boxes, at the mention of whose name Mr. Downs, after brushing up his hair, and adjusting his neckerchief, would inspect the aforesaid Lady So-and-so through an immense glass, and remark, either, that she was a fine woman, very fine woman, indeed, or that there might be a little more of her, Jones? Just as the case might happen to be. When the dancing began, John Downs and the other old boys were particularly anxious to see what was going forward on the stage, and Jones' wicked dog that Jones whispered little critical remarks into the ears of John Downs, which John Downs retailed to Mr. Harris and Mr. Harris to Mr. Jennings, and then they all 4 laughed, until the tears ran down out of their eyes. When the curtain fell, they walked back together, 2 and 2, to the steaks and oysters, and when they came to the second glass of brandy and water, Jones, hoaxing scamp, that Jones used to recount how he had observed a lady in white feathers, in one of the pit boxes, gazing intently on Mr. Downs all the evening, and how he had caught Mr. Downs, whenever he thought no one was looking at him, bestowing ardent looks of intense devotion on the lady in return, on which Mr. Harris and Mr. Jennings used to laugh very heartily, and John Downs more heartily than either of them, acknowledging, however, that the time had been when he might have done such things, upon which Mr. Jones used to poke him in the ribs, and tell him he had been a sad dog in his time, which John Downs with chuckles confessed. And after Mr. Harris and Mr. Jennings had preferred their claims to the character of having been sad dogs too, they separated harmoniously, and trotted home. The decrees of fate, and the means by which they are brought about, are mysterious and inscrutable. John Downs had led this life for 20 years and upwards, without wish for change, or care for variety, when his whole social system was suddenly upset and turned completely topsy-turvy, not by an earthquake, or some other dreadful convulsion of nature, as the reader would be inclined to suppose, but by the simple agency of an oyster, and thus it happened. Mr. John Downs was returning one night from the Sir Somebody's Head, to his residence in Cursitor Street, not tipsy, but rather excited, for it was Mr. Jennings's birthday, and they had had a brace of partridges for supper, and a brace of extra glasses afterwards, and Jones had been more than ordinarily amusing when his eyes rested on a newly opened oyster shop, on a magnificent scale, with natives laid, 1 deep, in circular marble basins in the windows, together with little round barrels of oysters directed to lords and baronets, and colonels and captains, in every part of the habitable globe. Behind the natives were the barrels, and behind the barrels was a young lady of about 25, all in blue, and all a low and splendid creature, charming face and lovely figure. It is difficult to say whether Mr. John Downs's red countenance, illuminated as it was by the flickering gaslight in the window before which he paused, excited the lady's risibility, or whether a natural exuberance of animal spirits proved too much for that staidness of demeanor which the forms of society rather dictatorially prescribe. But certain it is, that the lady smiled, then put her finger upon her lip, with a striking recollection of what was due to herself, and finally retired, in oyster-like bashfulness, to the very back of the counter. The sad dog sort of feeling came strongly upon John Dounce. He lingered. The lady in blue made no sign. He coughed till she came not. He entered the shop. "Can you open me an oyster, my dear?" said Mr. John Dounce. "Dare say I can, sir," replied the lady in blue, with playfulness. And Mr. John Dounce ate one oyster, and then looked at the young lady, and then ate another, and then squeezed the young lady's hand as she was opening the third, and so forth, until he had devoured a dozen of those at 8d in less than no time. "Can you open me half a dozen more, my dear?" inquired Mr. John Dounce. "I'll see what I can do for you, sir," replied the young lady in blue, even more bewitchingly than before, and Mr. John Dounce ate half a dozen more of those at 8d. "You couldn't manage to get me a glass of brandy and water, my dear, I suppose?" said Mr. John Dounce, when he had finished the oysters, in a tone which clearly implied his supposition that she could. "I'll see, sir," said the young lady, and away she ran out of the shop, and down the street, her long auburn ringlets shaking in the wind in the most enchanting manner, and back she came again, tripping over the coal cellar lids like a whipping top, with a tumbler of brandy and water, which Mr. John Dounce insisted on her taking a share of, as it was regular ladies' grog, hot, strong, sweet, and plenty of it. So, the young lady sat down with Mr. John Dounce, in a little red box with a green curtain, and took a small sip of the brandy and water, and a small look at Mr. John Dounce, and then turned her head away, and went through various other serio-pantomimic fascinations, which forcibly reminded Mr. John Dounce of the first time he courted his first wife, and which made him feel more affectionate than ever, in pursuance of which affection, and actuated by which feeling, Mr. John Dounce sounded the young lady on her matrimonial engagements. When the young lady denied having formed any such engagements at all, she couldn't bear the men, they were such deceivers. Thereupon Mr. John Dounce inquired whether this sweeping condemnation was meant to include other than very young men, on which the young lady blushed deeply. At least she turned away her head, and said Mr. John Dounce had made her blush, so of course she did blush, and Mr. John Dounce was a long time drinking the brandy and water. And, at last, John Dounce went home to bed, and dreamed of his first wife, and his second wife, and the young lady, and partridges, and oysters, and brandy and water, and disinterested attachments. The next morning, John Dounce was rather feverish with the extra brandy and water of the previous night, and, partly in the hope of cooling himself with an oyster, and partly with the view of ascertaining whether he owed the young lady anything, or not, went back to the oyster shop. If the young lady had appeared beautiful by night, she was perfectly irresistible by day, and, from this time forward, a change came over the spirit of John Dounce's dream. He bought shirt pins, wore a ring on his third finger, read poetry, bribed a cheap miniature painter to perpetrate a faint resemblance to a youthful face, with a curtain over his head, 6 large books in the background, and an open country in the distance. This he called his portrait, went on altogether in such an uproarious manner, that the 3 Miss Dounces went off on small pensions, he having made the tenement in Cursitor Street too warm to contain them, and in short, comported and demeaned himself in every respect like an unmitigated old Saracen, as he was. As to his ancient friends, the other old boys, at the Sir Somebody's head, he dropped off from them by gradual degrees, for, even when he did go the Jones vulgar fellow, the Jones persisted in asking when it was to be, and whether he was to have any gloves, together with other inquiries of an equally offensive nature, at which not only Harris laughed, but Jennings also. So, he cut the two, altogether, and attached himself solely to the blue young lady at the smart oyster shop. Now comes the moral of the story, for it has a moral after all. The last mentioned young lady, having derived sufficient profit and emolument from John Dounce's attachment, not only refused, when matters came to a crisis, to take him for better for worse, but expressly declared, to use her own forcible words, that she wouldn't have him at no price, and John Dounce, having lost his old friends, alienated his relations, and rendered himself ridiculous to everybody, made offers successively to a schoolmistress, a landlady, a feminine tobacconist, and a housekeeper, and, being directly rejected by each and every of them, was accepted by his cook, with whom he now lives, a henpecked husband, a melancholy monument of antiquated misery, and a living warning to all uxorious old boys. Chapter 8. The Mistaken Milliner. A Tale of Ambition. Miss Amelia Martin was pale, tallish, thin, and 32 what ill-natured people would call plain, and police reports interesting. She was a milliner and dressmaker, living on her business and not above it. If you had been a young lady in service, and had wanted Miss Martin, as a great many young ladies in service did, you would just have stepped up, in the evening, to number 47, Drummond Street, George Street, Euston Square, and after casting your eye on a brass door plate, 1 foot 10 by 1.5, ornamented with a great brass knob at each of the 4 corners, and bearing the inscription Miss Martin, Millinery and Dressmaking, in all its branches, you'd just have knocked 2 loud knocks at the street door, and down would have come Miss Martin herself, in a merino gown of the newest fashion, black velvet bracelets on the genteelest principle, and other little elegancies of the most approved description. If Miss Martin knew the young lady who called, or if the young lady who called had been recommended by any other young lady whom Miss Martin knew, Miss Martin would forthwith show her upstairs into the 2-pair front, and chat. She would so kind, and so comfortable it really wasn't like a matter of business, she was so friendly, and, then Miss Martin, after contemplating the figure and general appearance of the young lady in service with great apparent admiration, would say how well she would look, to be sure, in a low dress with short sleeves, made very full in the skirts, with 4 tucks in the bottom, to which the young lady in service would reply in terms expressive of her entire concurrence in the notion, and of the virtuous indignation with which she reflected on the tyranny of Mrs., who wouldn't allow a young girl to wear a short sleeve of an afternoon, no, nor nothing smart, not even a pair of earrings, let alone hiding people's heads of hair under them frightful caps. At the termination of this complaint, Miss Amelia Martin would distantly suggest certain dark suspicions that some people were jealous on account of their own daughters, and were obliged to keep their servants' charms under, for fear they should get married first, which was no uncommon circumstance. Leastways she had known 2 or 3 young ladies in service, who had married a great deal better than their missuses, and they were not very good-looking either, and then the young lady would inform Miss Martin, in confidence, that how one of their young ladies was engaged to a young man and was going to be married, and Mrs. was so proud about it there was no bearing of her, but how she needn't hold her head quite so high neither, for, after all, he was only a clerk. And, after expressing due contempt for clerks in general, and the engaged clerk in particular, and the highest opinion possible of themselves and each other, Miss Martin and the young lady in service would bid each other good night, in a friendly but perfectly genteel manner, and the one went back to her place, and the other, to her room on the 2nd floor front. There is no saying how long Miss Amelia Martin might have continued this course of life, how extensive a connection she might have established among young ladies in service, or what amount her demands upon their quarterly receipts might have ultimately attained, had not an unforeseen train of circumstances directed her thoughts to a sphere of action very different from dressmaking or millinery. A friend of Miss Martin's, who had long been keeping company with an ornamental painter and decorator's journeyman, at last consented, on being at last asked to do so, to name the day which would make the aforesaid journeyman a happy husband. It was a Monday that was appointed for the celebration of the nuptials, and Miss Amelia Martin was invited, among others, to honor the wedding dinner with her presence. It was a charming party, Somers Town the locality, and a front parlor the apartment. The ornamental painter and decorator's journeyman had taken a house, no lodgings nor vulgarity of that kind, but a house 4 beautiful rooms, and a delightful little wash-house at the end of the passage, which was the most convenient thing in the world, for the bridesmaids could sit in the front parlor and receive the company, and then run into the little wash-house and see how the pudding and boiled pork were getting on in the copper, and then pop back into the parlor again, as snug and comfortable as possible. And such a parlor as it was. Beautiful Kidderminster carpet, 6 brand new cane-bottomed stained chairs, 3 wine glasses and a tumbler on each sideboard, a farmer's girl and farmer's boy on the mantelpiece, girl tumbling over a stile, and boy spitting himself, on the handle of a pitchfork, long white dimity curtains in the window, and, in short, everything on the most genteel scale imaginable. Then, the dinner. There was baked leg of mutton at the top, boiled leg of mutton at the bottom, pair of fowls and leg of pork in the middle, porter pots at the corners, pepper, mustard, and vinegar in the center, vegetables on the floor, and plum pudding and apple pie and tartlets without number, to say nothing of cheese, and celery, and watercresses, and all that sort of thing. As to the company, Miss Amelia Martin herself declared, on a subsequent occasion, that, much as she had heard of the ornamental painter's journeyman's connection, she never could have supposed it was half so genteel. There was his father, such a funny old gentleman, and his mother, such a dear old lady, and his sister, such a charming girl, and his brother, such a manly-looking young man with such an eye. But even all these were as nothing when compared with his musical friends, Mr. and Mrs. Jennings Rodolph, from White Conduit, with whom the ornamental painter's journeyman had been fortunate enough to contract an intimacy while engaged in decorating the concert room of that noble institution. To hear them sing separately, was divine, but when they went through the tragic duet of Red Ruffian, Retire, it was, as Miss Martin afterwards remarked, thrilling. And why, as Mr. Jennings Rodolph observed, why were they not engaged at one of the patent theatres? If he was to be told that their voices were not powerful enough to fill the house, his only reply was, that he would back himself for any amount to fill Russell Square, a statement in which the company, after hearing the duet, expressed their full belief, so they all said it was shameful treatment, and both Mr. and Mrs. Jennings Rodolph said it was shameful too, and Mr. Jennings Rodolph looked very serious, and said he knew who his malignant opponents were, but they had better take care how far they went, for if they irritated him too much he had not quite made up his mind whether he wouldn't bring the subject before Parliament, and they all agreed that it would serve them quite right, and it was very proper that such people should be made an example of. So Mr. Jennings Rodolph said he'd think of it. When the conversation resumed its former tone, Mr. Jennings Rodolph claimed his right to call upon a lady, and the right being conceded, trusted Miss Martin would favour the company, a proposal which met with unanimous approbation, whereupon Miss Martin, after sundry hesitatings and coughings, with a preparatory choke or two, and an introductory declaration that she was frightened to death to attempt it before such great judges of the art, commenced a species of treble chirruping containing frequent allusions to some young gentleman of the name of Henry, with an occasional reference to madness and broken hearts. Mr. Jennings Rodolph frequently interrupted the progress of the song, by ejaculating beautiful ! Charming ! Brilliant ! Oh! Splendid! And see, and at its close the admiration of himself and his lady knew no bounds. "Did you ever hear so sweet a voice, my dear?" inquired Mr. Jennings Rodolph of Mrs. Jennings Rodolph. "Never. Indeed I never did, love," replied Mrs. Jennings Rodolph. "Don't you think Miss Martin, with a little cultivation, would be very like Signora Maraboni, my dear?" asked Mr. Jennings Rodolph. "Just exactly the very thing that struck me, my love," answered Mrs. Jennings Rodolph. And thus the time passed away. Mr. Jennings Rodolph played tunes on a walking stick, and then went behind the parlour door and gave his celebrated imitations of actors, edge tools, and animals. Miss Martin sang several other songs with increased admiration every time, and even the funny old gentleman began singing. His song had properly 7 verses, but as he couldn't recollect more than the first one, he sang that over 7 times, apparently very much to his own personal gratification. And then all the company sang the national anthem with national independence each for himself, without reference to the other, and finally separated, all declaring that they never had spent so pleasant an evening, and Miss Martin inwardly resolving to adopt the advice of Mr. Jennings Rodolph, and to come out without delay. Now, coming out, either in acting, or singing, or society, or facetiousness, or anything else, is all very well, and remarkably pleasant to the individual principally concerned, if he or she can but manage to come out with a burst, and being out, to keep out, and not go in again. But it does unfortunately happen that both consummations are extremely difficult to accomplish, and that the difficulties, of getting out at all in the first instance, and if you surmount them, of keeping out in the second, are pretty much on a par, and no slight ones either, and so Miss Amelia Martin shortly discovered. It is a singular fact, the being ladies in the case, that Miss Amelia Martin's principal foible was vanity, and the leading characteristic of Mrs. Jennings Rodolph an attachment to dress. Dismal wailings were heard to issue from the second floor front of number 47, Drummond Street, George Street, Euston Square. It was Miss Martin practicing. Half-suppressed murmurs disturbed the calm dignity of the White Conduit Orchestra at the commencement of the season. It was the appearance of Mrs. Jennings Rodolph in full dress that occasioned them. Miss Martin studied incessantly, the practicing was the consequence. Mrs. Jennings Rodolph taught gratuitously now and then, the dresses were the result. Weeks passed away, the White Conduit season had begun, and progressed, and was more than half over. The dressmaking business had fallen off, from neglect, and its profits had dwindled away almost imperceptibly. A benefit night approached. Mr. Jennings Rodolph yielded to the earnest solicitations of Miss Amelia Martin, and introduced her personally to the comic gentleman whose benefit it was. The comic gentleman was all smiles and blandness. He had composed a duet, expressly for the occasion, and Miss Martin should sing it with him. The night arrived. There was an immense room, 97 sixpennorths of gin and water, 32 small glasses of brandy and water, 25 bottled ales, and 41 negusses, and the ornamental painter's journeyman, with his wife and a select circle of acquaintance, was seated at one of the side tables near the orchestra. The concert began. Song sentimental by a light-haired young gentleman in a blue coat, and bright basket buttons. Applause. Another song, doubtful, by another gentleman in another blue coat and more bright basket buttons increased applause. Duet, Mr. Jennings Rodolph, and Mrs. Jennings Rodolph, Red Ruffian, retire! Great applause. Solo, Miss Julia Montague, positively on this occasion only I am a friar! Enthusiasm. Original duet, comic Mr. H. Taplin, the comic gentleman, and Miss Martin the time of day. Bravo! Bravo! Cried the ornamental painter's journeyman's party, as Miss Martin was gracefully led in by the comic gentleman. Go to work, Harry, cried the comic gentleman's personal friends. Tap tap tap, went the leader's bow on the music desk. The symphony began, and was soon afterwards followed by a faint kind of ventriloquial chirping, proceeding apparently from the deepest recesses of the interior of Miss Amelia Martin. Sing out! Shouted one gentleman in a white greatcoat. Don't be afraid to put the steam on, old gal, exclaimed another. SSSSSSS went the 25 bottled ales. Shame, shame, remonstrated the ornamental painter's journeyman's party. SSSS went the bottled ales again, accompanied by all the gins, and a majority of the brandies. Turn them geese out, cried the ornamental painter's journeyman's party, with great indignation. Sing out, whispered Mr. Jennings Rodolph. So I do, responded Miss Amelia Martin. Sing louder, said Mrs. Jennings Rodolph. I can't, replied Miss Amelia Martin. Off, 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 cried the rest of the audience. Bravo! Shouted the painter's party. It wouldn't do. Miss Amelia Martin left the orchestra, with much less ceremony than she had entered it, and, as she couldn't sing out, never came out. The general good humor was not restored until Mr. Jennings Rodolph had become purple in the face, by imitating divers quadrupeds for half an hour, without being able to render himself audible, and, to this day, neither has Miss Amelia Martin's good humor been restored, nor the dresses made for and presented to Mrs. Jennings Rodolph, nor the local abilities which Mr. Jennings Rodolph once staked his professional reputation that Miss Martin possessed. Chapter 9 The Dancing Academy. Of all the dancing academies that ever were established, there never was one more popular in its immediate vicinity than Senior Bilsmthy's, of the King's Theatre. It was not in Spring Gardens, or Newman Street, or Berners Street, or Gower Street, or Charlotte Street, or Percy Street, or any other of the numerous streets which have been devoted time out of mind to professional people, dispensaries, and boarding houses. It was not in the West End at all. It rather approximated to the eastern portion of London, being situated in the populous and improving neighbourhood of Gray's Inn Lane. It was not a dear dancing academy. 4 and 6pence a quarter is decidedly cheap upon the whole. It was very select, the number of pupils being strictly limited to 75, and a quarter's payment in advance being rigidly exacted. There was public tuition and private tuition, an assembly room and a parlour. Senior Bilsmthy's family were always thrown in with the parlour, and included in parlour price, that is to say, a private pupil had Senior Bilsmthy's parlour to dance in, and Senior Bilsmthy's family to dance with, and when he had been sufficiently broken in the parlour, he began to run in couples in the assembly room. Such was the dancing academy of Senior Bilsmthy, when Mr. Augustus Cooper, of Fetter Lane, first saw an unstamped advertisement walking leisurely down Holborn Hill, announcing to the world that Senior Bilsmthy, of the King's Theatre, intended opening for the season with a grand ball. Now, Mr. Augustus Cooper was in the oil and colour line, just of age, with a little money, a little business, and a little mother, who, having managed her husband and his business in his lifetime, took to managing her son and his business after his decease, and so, somehow or other, he had been cooped up in the little back parlour behind the shop on weekdays, and in a little deal box without a lid, called by courtesy a pew, at Bethel Chapel, on Sundays, and had seen no more of the world than if he had been an infant all his days, whereas young White, at the gas-fitters over the way, 3 years younger than him, had been flaring away like Wink and going to the theatre, supping at harmonic meetings, eating oysters by the barrel, drinking stout by the gallon, even out all night, and coming home as cool in the morning as if nothing had happened. So Mr. Augustus Cooper made up his mind that he would not stand it any longer, and had that very morning expressed to his mother a firm determination to be blowed, in the event of his not being instantly provided with a street door key. And he was walking down Holborn Hill, thinking about all these things, and wondering how he could manage to get introduced into genteel society for the first time, when his eyes rested on Senior Bilsmthy's announcement, which it immediately struck him was just the very thing he wanted, for he should not only be able to select a genteel circle of acquaintance at once, out of the 75 pupils at 4 and 6pence a quarter, but should qualify himself at the same time to go through a hornpipe and private society, with perfect ease to himself and great delight to his friends. So, he stopped the unstamped advertisement, an animated sandwich, composed of a boy between two boards, and having procured a very small card with the senior's address indented thereon, walked straight at once to the senior's house, and very fast he walked too, for fear the list should be filled up, and the 75 completed, before he got there. The senior was at home, and, what was still more gratifying, he was an Englishman. Such a nice man and so polite. The list was not full, but it was a most extraordinary circumstance that there was only just one vacancy, and even that one would have been filled up that very morning, only Signor Bilsmy was dissatisfied with the reference, and, being very much afraid that the lady wasn't select, wouldn't take her, and very much delighted I am, Mr. Cooper, said Signor Bilsmy, that I did not take her. I assure you, Mr. Cooper, I don't say it to flatter you, for I know you're above it, that I consider myself extremely fortunate in having a gentleman of your manners and appearance, sir. I am very glad of it too, sir, said Augustus Cooper, and I hope we shall be better acquainted, sir, said Signor Bilsmy, and I'm sure I hope we shall too, sir, responded Augustus Cooper. Just then, the door opened, and in came a young lady, with her hair curled in a crop all over her head, and her shoes tied in sandals all over her ankles. Don't run away, my dear, said Signor Bilsmy, for the young lady didn't know Mr. Cooper was there when she ran in, and was going to run out again in her modesty, all in confusion like. Don't run away, my dear, said Signor Bilsmy, this is Mr. Cooper, of Fetter Lane. Mr. Cooper, my daughter, Sir Miss Bilsmy, sir, who I hope will have the pleasure of dancing many a quadrille, minuet, gavotte, country dance, fandango, double hornpipe, and Faranaghalkajingo with you, sir. She dances them all, sir, and so shall you, sir, before you're a quarter older, sir, and Signor Bilsmy slapped Mr. Augustus Cooper on the back, as if he had known him a dozen years, so friendly, and Mr. Cooper bowed to the young lady, and the young lady curtsied to him, and Signor Bilsmy said they were as handsome a pair as ever he'd wished to see, upon which the young lady exclaimed, Law, pa, and blushed as red as Mr. Cooper himself. You might have thought they were both standing under a red lamp at a chemist's shop, and before Mr. Cooper went away it was settled that he should join the family circle that very night, taking them just as they were, no ceremony nor nonsense of that kind, and learn his positions in order that he might lose no time, and be able to come out at the forthcoming ball. Well, Mr. Augustus Cooper went away to one of the cheap shoemakers' shops in Holborn, where gentlemen's dress pumps are 7 and 6pence, and men's strong walking just nothing at all, and bought a pair of the regular 7 and 6penny, long-quartered, town maids, in which he astonished himself quite as much as his mother, and sallied forth to Signor Bilsmy's. There were 4 other private pupils in the parlour, 2 ladies and 2 gentlemen. Such nice people. Not a bit of pride about them. One of the ladies in particular, who was in training for a Columbine, was remarkably affable, and she and Miss Bilsmy took such an interest in Mr. Augustus Cooper, and joked, and smiled, and looked so bewitching, that he got quite at home, and learnt his steps in no time. After the practising was over, Signor Bilsmy, and Miss Bilsmy, and Master Bilsmy, and a young lady, and the 2 ladies, and the 2 gentlemen, danced a quadrille, none of your slipping and sliding about, but regular warm work, flying into corners, and diving among chairs, and shooting out at the door, something like dancing. Signor Bilsmy in particular, notwithstanding his having a little fiddle to play all the time, was out on the landing every figure, and Master Bilsmy, when everybody else was breathless, danced a hornpipe, with a cane in his hand, and a cheese plate on his head, to the unqualified admiration of the whole company. Then, Signor Bilsmy insisted, as they were so happy, that they should all stay to supper, and proposed sending Master Bilsmy for the beer and spirits, whereupon the 2 gentlemen swore, strike and vulgar if they'd stand that, and were just going to quarrel who should pay for it, when Mr. Augustus Cooper said he would, if they'd have the kindness to allow him, and they had the kindness to allow him, and Master Bilsmy brought the beer in a can, and the rum in a quart pot. They had a regular night of it, and Miss Bilsmy squeezed Mr. Augustus Cooper's hand under the table, and Mr. Augustus Cooper returned the squeeze, and returned home too, at something to 6 o'clock in the morning, when he was put to bed by main force by the apprentice, after repeatedly expressing an uncontrollable desire to pitch his revered parent out of the 2nd-floor window, and to throttle the apprentice with his own neck-handkerchief. Weeks had worn on, and the 7 and 6penny town maids had nearly worn out, when the night arrived for the grand dress ball, at which the whole of the 75 pupils were to meet together, for the first time that season, and to take out some portion of their respective 4 and 6pences in lamp oil and fiddlers. Mr. Augustus Cooper had ordered a new coat for the occasion, a £2 tenner from Turnstile. It was his first appearance in public, and, After a grand Sicilian shawl dance by 14 young ladies in character, he was to open the quadrille department with Miss Bilsmedy herself, with whom he had become quite intimate since his first introduction. It was a night. Everything was admirably arranged. The sandwich boy took the hats and bonnets at the street door. There was a turn-up bedstead in the back parlour, on which Miss Bilsmedy made tea and coffee for such of the gentlemen as chose to pay for it, and such of the ladies as the gentlemen treated. Red port wine, negus and lemonade were handed round at 18 pence a head, and in pursuance of a previous engagement with a public house at the corner of the street, an extra pot boy was laid on for the occasion. In short, nothing could exceed the arrangements, except the company. Such ladies, such pink silk stockings, such artificial flowers, such a number of cabs. No sooner had one cab set down a couple of ladies, than another cab drove up and set down another couple of ladies, and they all knew, not only one another, but the majority of the gentlemen into the bargain, which made it all as pleasant and lively as could be. Signor Bilsmedy, in black tights, with a large blue bow in his buttonhole, introduced the ladies to such of the gentlemen as were strangers, and the ladies talked away and laughed. It was delightful to see them. As to the shawl dance, it was the most exciting thing that ever was beheld. There was such a whisking, and rustling, and fanning, and getting ladies into a tangle with artificial flowers, and then disentangling them again. And as to Mr. Augustus Cooper's share in the quadrille, he got through it admirably. He was missing from his partner, now and then, certainly, and discovered on such occasions to be either dancing with laudable perseverance in another set, or sliding about in perspective, without any definite object, but, generally speaking, they managed to shove him through the figure, until he turned up in the right place. Be this as it may, when he had finished, a great many ladies and gentlemen came up and complimented him very much, and said they had never seen a beginner do anything like it before, and Mr. Augustus Cooper was perfectly satisfied with himself, and everybody else into the bargain, and stood considerable quantities of spirits and water, negus, and compounds, for the use and behoof of 2 or 3 dozen very particular friends, selected from the select circle of 75 pupils. Now, whether it was the strength of the compounds, or the beauty of the ladies, or what not, it did so happen that Mr. Augustus Cooper encouraged, rather than repelled, the very flattering attentions of a young lady in brown gauze over white calico who had appeared particularly struck with him from the first, and when the encouragements had been prolonged for some time, Miss Bilsmedy betrayed her spite and jealousy thereat by calling the young lady in brown gauze a creature, which induced the young lady in brown gauze to retort, in certain sentences containing a taunt founded on the payment of 4 and 6pence a quarter, which reference Mr. Augustus Cooper, being then and there in a state of considerable bewilderment, expressed his entire concurrence in. Miss Bilsmedy, thus renounced, forthwith began screaming in the loudest key of her voice, at the rate of 14 screams a minute, and being unsuccessful, in an onslaught on the eyes and face, first of the lady in gauze and then of Mr. Augustus Cooper, called distractedly on the other 73 pupils to furnish her with oxalic acid for her own private drinking, and, the call not being honoured, made another rush at Mr. Cooper, and then had her staylace cut, and was carried off to bed. Mr. Augustus Cooper, not being remarkable for quickness of apprehension, was at a loss to understand what all this meant, until Signor Bilsmedy explained it in a most satisfactory manner, by stating to the pupils, that Mr. Augustus Cooper had made and confirmed divers promises of marriage to his daughter on divers occasions, and had now basely deserted her, on which, the indignation of the pupils became universal, and as several chivalrous gentlemen inquired rather pressingly of Mr. Augustus Cooper, whether he required anything for his own use, or, in other words, whether he wanted anything for himself, he deemed it prudent to make a precipitate retreat. And the upshot of the matter was, that a lawyer's letter came next day, and an action was commenced next week, and that Mr. Augustus Cooper, after walking twice to the Serpentine for the purpose of drowning himself, and coming twice back without doing it, made a confidant of his mother, who compromised the matter with £20 from the till, which made £20 4 shillings and 6pence paid to Signor Bilsmedy, exclusive of treats and pumps. And Mr. Augustus Cooper went back and lived with his mother, and there he lives to this day, and as he has lost his ambition for society, and never goes into the world, he will never see this account of himself, and will never be any the wiser. Chapter 10 Shabby Genteel People. There are certain descriptions of people who, oddly enough, appear to appertain exclusively to the metropolis. You meet them, every day, in the streets of London, but no one ever encounters them elsewhere. They seem indigenous to the soil, and to belong as exclusively to London as its own smoke, or the dingy bricks and mortar. We could illustrate the remark by a variety of examples, but, In our present sketch, we will only advert to one class as a specimen, that class which is so aptly and expressively designated as shabby genteel. Now, shabby people, God knows, may be found anywhere, and genteel people are not articles of greater scarcity out of London than in it, but this compound of the two, this shabby gentility, is as purely local as the statue at Charing Cross, or the pump at Aldgate. It is worthy of remark, too, that only men are shabby genteel. A woman is always either dirty and slovenly in the extreme, or neat and respectable, however poverty-stricken in appearance. A very poor man, who has seen better days, as the phrase goes, is a strange compound of dirty slovenliness and wretched attempts at faded smartness. We will endeavor to explain our conception of the term which forms the title of this paper. If you meet a man, lounging up Drury Lane, or leaning with his back against a post in Long Acre, with his hands in the pockets of a pair of drab trousers plentifully besprinkled with grease spots, the trousers made very full over the boots, and ornamented with 2 cords down the outside of each leg, wearing, also, what has been a brown coat with bright buttons, and a hat very much pinched up at the side, cocked over his right eye, don't pity him. He is not shabby genteel. The harmonic meetings at some fourth-rate public house, or the purlieus of a private theatre, are his chosen haunts. He entertains a rooted antipathy to any kind of work, and is on familiar terms with several pantomime men at the large houses. But, if you see hurrying along a by-street, keeping as close as he can to the area railings, a man of about 40 or 50, clad in an old rusty suit of threadbare black cloth which shines with constant wear as if it had been beeswaxed, the trousers tightly strapped down, partly for the look of the thing and partly to keep his old shoes from slipping off at the heels, if you observe, too, that his yellowish-white neckerchief is carefully pinned up, to conceal the tattered garment underneath, and that his hands are encased in the remains of an old pair of beaver gloves, you may set him down as a shabby genteel man. A glance at that depressed face, and timorous air of conscious poverty, will make your heart ache, always supposing that you are neither a philosopher nor a political economist. We were once haunted by a shabby genteel man. He was bodily present to our senses all day, and he was in our mind's eye all night. The man of whom Sir Walter Scott speaks in his Demonology, did not suffer half the persecution from his imaginary gentleman usher in black velvet, that we sustained from our friend in quondam black cloth. He first attracted our notice, by sitting opposite to us in the reading room at the British Museum, and what made the man more remarkable was, that he always had before him a couple of shabby genteel books, 2 old dog's-eared folios, in mouldy worm-eaten covers, which had once been smart. He was in his chair, every morning, just as the clock struck 10, he was always the last to leave the room in the afternoon, and when he did, he quitted it with the air of a man who knew not where else to go, for warmth and quiet. There he used to sit all day, as close to the table as possible, in order to conceal the lack of buttons on his coat, with his old hat carefully deposited at his feet, where he evidently flattered himself it escaped observation. About 2 o'clock, you would see him munching a French roll or a penny loaf, not taking it boldly out of his pocket at once, like a man who knew he was only making a lunch, but breaking off little bits in his pocket, and eating them by stealth. He knew too well it was his dinner. When we first saw this poor object, we thought it quite impossible that his attire could ever become worse. We even went so far, as to speculate on the possibility of his shortly appearing in a decent second-hand suit. We knew nothing about the matter. He grew more and more shabby genteel every day. The buttons dropped off his waistcoat, one by one, then, he buttoned his coat, and when one side of the coat was reduced to the same condition as the waistcoat, he buttoned it over on the other side. He looked somewhat better at the beginning of the week than at the conclusion, because the neckerchief, though yellow, was not quite so dingy, and, in the midst of all this wretchedness, he never appeared without gloves and straps. He remained in this state for a week or 2. At length, one of the buttons on the back of the coat fell off, and then the man himself disappeared, and we thought he was dead. We were sitting at the same table about a week after his disappearance, and as our eyes rested on his vacant chair, we insensibly fell into a train of meditation on the subject of his retirement from public life. We were wondering whether he had hung himself, or thrown himself off a bridge, whether he really was dead or had only been arrested, when our conjectures were suddenly set at rest by the entry of the man himself. He had undergone some strange metamorphosis, and walked up the center of the room with an air which showed he was fully conscious of the improvement in his appearance. It was very odd. His clothes were a fine, deep, glossy black, and yet they looked like the same suit. Nay, there were the very darns with which old acquaintance had made us familiar. The hat, too, nobody could mistake the shape of that hat, with its high crown gradually increasing in circumference towards the top. Long service had imparted to it a reddish-brown tint, but, now, it was as black as the coat. The truth flashed suddenly upon us: they had been revived. It is a deceitful liquid, that black and blue reviver. We have watched its effects on many a shabby genteel man. It betrays its victims into a temporary assumption of importance, possibly into the purchase of a new pair of gloves, or a cheap stock, or some other trifling article of dress. It elevates their spirits for a week, only to depress them, if possible, below their original level. It was so in this case. The transient dignity of the unhappy man decreased, in exact proportion as the reviver wore off. The knees of the unmentionables, and the elbows of the coat, and the seams generally, soon began to get alarmingly white. The hat was once more deposited under the table, and its owner crept into his seat as quietly as ever. There was a week of incessant small rain and mist. At its expiration the reviver had entirely vanished, and the shabby genteel man never afterwards attempted to effect any improvement in his outward appearance. It would be difficult to name any particular part of town as the principal resort of shabby genteel men. We have met a great many persons of this description in the neighborhood of the Inns of Court. They may be met with, in Holborn, between 8 and 10 any morning, and whoever has the curiosity to enter the insolvent debtors' court will observe, both among spectators and practitioners, a great variety of them. We never went on 'Change, by any chance, without seeing some shabby genteel men, and we have often wondered what earthly business they can have there. They will sit there, for hours, leaning on great, dropsical, mildewed umbrellas, or eating Abernethy biscuits. Nobody speaks to them, nor they to anyone. On consideration, we remember to have occasionally seen 2 shabby genteel men conversing together on 'Change, but our experience assures us that this is an uncommon circumstance, occasioned by the offer of a pinch of snuff, or some such civility. It would be a task of equal difficulty, either to assign any particular spot for the residence of these beings, or to endeavor to enumerate their general occupations. We were never engaged in business with more than one shabby genteel man, and he was a drunken engraver, and lived in a damp back parlour in a new row of houses at Camden Town, half street, half brick field, somewhere near the canal. A shabby genteel man may have no occupation, or he may be a corn agent, or a coal agent, or a wine merchant, or a collector of debts, or a broker's assistant, or a broken-down attorney. He may be a clerk of the lowest description, or a contributor to the press of the same grade. Whether our readers have noticed these men, in their walks, as often as we have, we know not. This we know, that the miserably poor man, no matter whether he owes his distresses to his own conduct, or that of others, who feels his poverty and vainly strives to conceal it, is one of the most pitiable objects in human nature. Such objects, with few exceptions, are shabby genteel people. Chapter 11. Making a night of it. Damon and Pythias were undoubtedly very good fellows in their way, the former for his extreme readiness to put in special bail for a friend, and the latter for a certain trump-like punctuality in turning up just in the very nick of time, scarcely less remarkable. Many points in their character have, however, grown obsolete. Demons are rather hard to find, in these days of imprisonment for debt, except the sham ones, and they cost half a crown, and, as to the Pythiases, the few that have existed in these degenerate times, have had an unfortunate knack of making themselves scarce, at the very moment when their appearance would have been strictly classical. If the actions of these heroes, however, can find no parallel in modern times, their friendship can. We have Damon and Pythias on the one hand. We have Potter and Smithers on the other, and, lest the 2 last mentioned names should never have reached the ears of our unenlightened readers, we can do no better than make them acquainted with the owners thereof. Mr. Thomas Potter, then, was a clerk in the city, and Mr. Robert Smithers was a ditto in the same. Their incomes were limited, but their friendship was unbounded. They lived in the same street, walked into town every morning at the same hour, dined at the same slap-bang every day, and revelled in each other's company very night. They were knit together by the closest ties of intimacy and friendship, or, as Mr. Thomas Potter touchingly observed, they were thick and thin pals, and nothing but it. There was a spice of romance in Mr. Smithers's disposition, a ray of poetry, a gleam of misery, a sort of consciousness of he didn't exactly know what, coming across him he didn't precisely know why, which stood out in fine relief against the offhand, dashing, amateur pickpocket sort of manner, which distinguished Mr. Potter in an eminent degree. The peculiarity of their respective dispositions extended itself to their individual costume. Mr. Smithers generally appeared in public in a surtout and shoes, with a narrow black neckerchief and a brown hat, very much turned up at the sides, peculiarities which Mr. Potter wholly eschewed, for it was his ambition to do something in the celebrated kiddie or stagecoach way, and he had even gone so far as to invest capital in the purchase of a rough blue coat with wooden buttons, made upon the fireman's principle, in which, with the addition of a low-crowned, flower-pot saucer-shaped hat, he had created no inconsiderable sensation at the Albion in Little Russell Street, and divers other places of public and fashionable resort. Mr. Potter and Mr. Smithers had mutually agreed that, on the receipt of their quarter's salary, they would jointly and in company spend the evening, an evident misnomer, the spending applying, as everybody knows, not to the evening itself but to all the money the individual may chance to be possessed of, on the occasion to which reference is made, and they had likewise agreed that, on the evening aforesaid, they would make a night of it, an expressive term, implying the borrowing of several hours from tomorrow morning, adding them to the night before, and manufacturing a compound night of the whole. The quarter-day arrived at last. We say at last, because quarter-days are as eccentric as comets, moving wonderfully quick when you have a good deal to pay, and marvelously slow when you have a little to receive. Mr. Thomas Potter and Mr. Robert Smithers met by appointment to begin the evening with a dinner, and a nice, snug, comfortable dinner they had, consisting of a little procession of 4 chops and 4 kidneys, following each other, supported on either side by a pot of the real draught stout, and attended by divers cushions of bread, and wedges of cheese. When the cloth was removed, Mr. Thomas Potter ordered the waiter to bring in 2 goes of his best Scotch whisky, with warm water and sugar, and a couple of his very mildest Havanas, which the waiter did. Mr. Thomas Potter mixed his grog, and lighted his cigar. Mr. Robert Smithers did the same, and then, Mr. Thomas Potter jocularly proposed as the first toast, the abolition of all offices whatever, not sinecures, but counting houses, which was immediately drunk by Mr. Robert Smithers, with enthusiastic applause. So they went on, talking politics, puffing cigars, and sipping whisky and water, until the goes most appropriately so called were both gone, which Mr. Robert Smithers perceiving, immediately ordered in 2 more goes of the best Scotch whisky, and 2 more of the very mildest Havanas, and the goes kept coming in, and the mild Havanas kept going out, until, what with the drinking, and lighting, and puffing, and the stale ashes on the table, and the tallow grease on the cigars, Mr. Robert Smithers began to doubt the mildness of the Havanas, and to feel very much as if he had been sitting in a hackney coach with his back to the horses. As to Mr. Thomas Potter, he would keep laughing out loud, and volunteering inarticulate declarations that he was all right, in proof of which, he feebly bespoke the evening paper after the next gentleman, but finding it a matter of some difficulty to discover any news in its columns, or to ascertain distinctly whether it had any columns at all, walked slowly out to look for the moon, and, after coming back quite pale with looking up at the sky so long, and attempting to express mirth at Mr. Robert Smithers having fallen asleep, by various galvanic chuckles, laid his head on his arm, and went to sleep also. When he awoke again, Mr. Robert Smithers awoke too, and they both very gravely agreed that it was extremely unwise to eat so many pickled walnuts with the chops, as it was a notorious fact that they always made people queer and sleepy. Indeed, if it had not been for the whiskey and cigars, there was no knowing what harm they mightn't have done. So they took some coffee, and after paying the bill, 12 and 2pence the dinner, and the odd 10pence for the waiter, 13 shillings in all, started out on their expedition to manufacture a night. It was just 8:30, so they thought they couldn't do better than go at half price to the slips at the City Theatre, which they did accordingly. Mr. Robert Smithers, who had become extremely poetical after the settlement of the bill, enlivening the walk by informing Mr. Thomas Potter in confidence that he felt an inward presentiment of approaching dissolution, and subsequently embellishing the theatre, by falling asleep with his head and both arms gracefully drooping over the front of the boxes. Such was the quiet demeanour of the unassuming Smithers, and such were the happy effects of Scotch whisky and Havanas on that interesting person. But Mr. Thomas Potter, whose great aim it was to be considered as a knowing card, a fast goer, and so forth, conducted himself in a very different manner, and commenced going very fast indeed, rather too fast at last, for the patience of the audience to keep pace with him. On his first entry, he contented himself by earnestly calling upon the gentlemen in the gallery to flare up, accompanying the demand with another request, expressive of his wish that they would instantaneously form a union, both which requisitions were responded to, in the manner most in vogue on such occasions. "Give that dog a bone," cried one gentleman in his shirt sleeves. "Where have you been having half a pint of intermediate beer?" cried a second. "Tailor," screamed a third. "Barber's clerk," shouted a fourth. "Throw him over," roared a fifth, while numerous voices concurred in desiring Mr. Thomas Potter to go home to his mother. All these taunts Mr. Thomas Potter received with supreme contempt, cocking the low-crowned hat a little more on one side, whenever any reference was made to his personal appearance, and, standing up with his arms akimbo, expressing defiance melodramatically. The overture to which these various sounds had been an ad libitum accompaniment concluded, the second piece began, and Mr. Thomas Potter, emboldened by impunity, proceeded to behave in a most unprecedented and outrageous manner. First of all, he imitated the shake of the principal female singer, then, groaned at the blue fire, then, affected to be frightened into convulsions of terror at the appearance of the ghost, and, lastly, not only made a running commentary, in an audible voice, upon the dialogue on the stage, but actually awoke Mr. Robert Smithers, who, hearing his companion making a noise, and having a very indistinct notion where he was, or what was required of him, immediately, by way of imitating a good example, set up the most unearthly, unremitting, and appalling howling that ever audience heard. It was too much. "Turn them out," was the general cry. A noise, as of shuffling of feet, and men being knocked up with violence against wainscoting, was heard. A hurried dialogue of "Come out?" I1'T!" "You shall!" "I shan!" "Give me your card, sir?" "You're a scoundrel, sir," and so forth, succeeded. A round of applause betokened the approbation of the audience, and Mr. Robert Smithers and Mr. Thomas Potter found themselves shot with astonishing swiftness into the road, without having had the trouble of once putting foot to ground during the whole progress of their rapid descent. Mr. Robert Smithers, being constitutionally one of the slow-goers, and having had quite enough of fast-going, in the course of his recent expulsion, to last until the quarter-day then next ensuing at the very least, have no sooner emerged with his companion from the precincts of Milton Street, than he proceeded to indulge in circuitous references to the beauties of sleep, mingled with distant allusions to the propriety of returning to Islington, and testing the influence of their patent brammers over the street door locks to which they respectively belonged. Mr. Thomas Potter, however, was valorous and peremptory. They had come out to make a night of it, and a night must be made. So Mr. Robert Smithers, who was 3 parts dull, and the other dismal, despairingly assented, and they went into a wine vaults, to get materials for assisting them in making a night, where they found a good many young ladies, and various old gentlemen, and a plentiful sprinkling of hackney coachmen and cab drivers, all drinking and talking together, and Mr. Thomas Potter and Mr. Robert Smithers drank small glasses of brandy, and large glasses of soda, until they began to have a very confused idea, either of things in general, or of anything in particular, and, when they had done treating themselves they began to treat everybody else, and the rest of the entertainment was a confused mixture of heads and heels, black eyes and blue uniforms, mud and gas lights, thick doors, and stone paving. Then, as standard novelists expressively inform us, all was a blank. And in the morning the blank was filled up with the word station house, and the station house was filled up with Mr. Thomas Potter, Mr. Robert Smithers, and the major part of their wine vault companions of the preceding night, with a comparatively small portion of clothing of any kind. And it was disclosed at the police office, to the indignation of the bench, and the astonishment of the spectators, how one Robert Smithers, aided and abetted by one Thomas Potter, had knocked down and beaten, in divers streets, at different times, 5 men, 4 boys, and 3 women, how the said Thomas Potter had feloniously obtained possession of 5 door-knockers, 2 bell handles, and a bonnet, how Robert Smithers, his friend, had sworn, at least £40 worth of oaths, at the rate of 5 shillings apiece, terrified whole streets full of Her Majesty's subjects with awful shrieks and alarms of fire, destroyed the uniforms of 5 policemen, and committed various other atrocities, too numerous to recapitulate. And the magistrate, after an appropriate reprimand, fined Mr. Thomas Potter and Mr. Thomas Smithers 5 shillings each, for being, what the law vulgarly terms, drunk, and £34 for 17 assaults at 40 shillings a head, with liberty to speak to the prosecutors. The prosecutors were spoken to, and Messrs. Potter and Smithers lived on credit, for a quarter, as best they might, and, although the prosecutors expressed their readiness to be assaulted twice a week, on the same terms, they have never since been detected in making a night of it. Chapter 12. The Prisoner's Van. We were passing the corner of Bow Street, on our return from a lounging excursion the other afternoon, when a crowd, assembled round the door of the police office, attracted our attention. We turned up the street accordingly. There were 30 or 40 people, standing on the pavement and half across the road, and a few stragglers were patiently stationed on the opposite side of the way, all evidently waiting in expectation of some arrival. We waited too, a few minutes, but nothing occurred, so, we turned round to an unshorn, sallow-looking cobbler, who was standing next us with his hands under the bib of his apron, and put the usual question of what's the matter. The cobbler eyed us from head to foot, with superlative contempt, and laconically replied nothing. Now, we were perfectly aware that if 2 men stop in the street to look at any given object, or even to gaze in the air, 200 men will be assembled in no time. But, as we knew very well that no crowd of people could by possibility remain in a street for 5 minutes without getting up a little amusement among themselves, unless they had some absorbing object in view, the natural inquiry next in order was, "What are all these people waiting here for?" Her Majesty's carriage, replied the cobbler. This was still more extraordinary. We could not imagine what earthly business Her Majesty's carriage could have at the public office, Bow Street. We were beginning to ruminate on the possible causes of such an uncommon appearance, when a general exclamation from all the boys in the crowd of "Here's the one!" caused us to raise our heads, and look up the street. The covered vehicle, in which prisoners are conveyed from the police offices to the different prisons, was coming along at full speed. It then occurred to us, for the first time, that Her Majesty's carriage was merely another name for the prisoner's van, conferred upon it, not only by reason of the superior gentility of the term, but because the aforesaid van is maintained at Her Majesty's expense, having been originally started for the exclusive accommodation of ladies and gentlemen under the necessity of visiting the various houses of call known by the general denomination of Her Majesty's jails. The van drew up at the office door, and the people thronged round the steps, just leaving a little alley for the prisoners to pass through. Our friend the cobbler, and the other stragglers, crossed over, and we followed their example. The driver, and another man who had been seated by his side in front of the vehicle, dismounted, and were admitted into the office. The office door was closed after them, and the crowd were on the tiptoe of expectation. After a few minutes' delay, the door again opened, and the 2 first prisoners appeared. They were a couple of girls, of whom the elder could not be more than 16, and the younger of whom had certainly not attained her 14th year. That they were sisters, was evident, from the resemblance which still subsisted between them, though 2 additional years of depravity had fixed their brand upon the elder girl's features, as legibly as if red-hot iron had seared them. They were both gaudily dressed, the younger one especially, and, although there was a strong similarity between them in both respects, which was rendered the more obvious by their being handcuffed together, it is impossible to conceive a greater contrast than the demeanor of the 2 presented. The younger girl was weeping bitterly, not for display, or in the hope of producing effect, but for very shame. Her face was buried in her handkerchief, and her whole manner was but too expressive of bitter and unavailing sorrow. "How long are you for, Emily?" screamed a red-faced woman in the crowd. 6 weeks and labor, replied the eldest girl with a flaunting laugh, "and that's better than the stone jug anyhow. The mill's a deal better than the sessions, and here's Bella going too for the first time. Hold up your head, you chicken," she continued, boisterously tearing the other girl's handkerchief away. "Hold up your head, and show your face. I ain't jealous, but I'm blessed if I ain't game!" "That's right, old gal," exclaimed a man in a paper cap, who, in common with the greater part of the crowd, had been inexpressibly delighted with this little incident. "Right," replied the girl. "Ah, to be sure, what's the odds, "Come in with you," interrupted the driver. "Don't you be in a hurry, coachman," replied the girl, "and recollect I want to be set down in Cold Bathfield's large house with a high garden wall in front. You can't mistake it. Hello, Bella, where are you going to? You'll pull my precious arm off." This was addressed to the younger girl, who, in her anxiety to hide herself in the caravan, had ascended the steps first, and forgotten the strain upon the handcuff. "Come down, and let's show you the way." And after jerking the miserable girl down with a force which made her stagger on the pavement, she got into the vehicle, and was followed by her wretched companion. These 2 girls had been thrown upon London streets, their vices and debauchery, by a sordid and rapacious mother. What the younger girl was then, the elder had been once, and what the elder then was, the younger must soon become. A melancholy prospect, but how surely to be realized, a tragic drama, but how often acted. Turn to the prisons and police offices of London, nay, look into the very streets themselves. These things pass before our eyes, day after day, and hour after hour. They have become such matters of course, that they are utterly disregarded. The progress of these girls in crime will be as rapid as the flight of a pestilence, resembling it too in its baneful influence and wide-spreading infection. Step by step, how many wretched females, within the sphere of every man's observation, have become involved in a career of vice, frightful to contemplate, hopeless at its commencement, loathsome and repulsive in its course, friendless, forlorn, and unpitied, at its miserable conclusion. There were other prisoners, boys of 10, as hardened in vice as men of 50, a houseless vagrant, going joyfully to prison as a place of food and shelter, handcuffed to a man whose prospects were ruined, character lost, and family rendered destitute, by his first offense. Our curiosity, however, was satisfied. The first group had left an impression on our mind we would gladly have avoided, and would willingly have effaced. The crowd dispersed. The vehicle rolled away with its load of guilt and misfortune, and we saw no more of the prisoner's van.